the Springtown meeting of 2023. And we'll give you all a minute to collect yourselves and for my assistant moderator to make it back up on the podium. Can everyone hear me all right? Awesome. All right, we are going to start without Mr. Assistant Moderator, who is out gallivanting. So, I am reconvening Special Town Meeting 1. We are finally getting to it. But to start on a serious note, I need to make a very serious statement, which is an apology to Susan Park, Chi-Chi Wu, and to all of you. Yesterday, when Susan Park got up to speak, I called on her as Chi-Chi Wu. That was a racial insult. There is no excuse. I am embarrassed that I did it, and I apologized to both of them, and I apologized to you. I like to think of myself as someone who is not racist, but I am, and I just showed it. We are all racist, and we cannot deny it. That's why I think it is very important that we establish committees and commissions to represent the underrepresented, underrecognized, marginalized members of Brookline, such as the brown and black population, the Asian American Pacific Islander heritage population, the Indigenous peoples population, the MLK Celebration Commission, and other minorities. And again, I take full responsibility. I own what I did. And I'd like to recognize Ms. Park. Yes.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Susan Park, Precinct 17. I just want to say thank you. I totally forgive you. Don't worry about it. And I say that only because I have done the same thing. But thank you for your apology.
That is very gracious. Thank you. And we will now move on to guns, which is okay. This is an article which seeks to modify a Brookline bylaw relating to the discharge and carrying of firearms in Brookline. It is found on the special town meeting warrant and supplement sent out, supplement 2, pages 3 through 4, brought by Mr. Ishak and seconded by Ms. Khan. And I call Mr. Ishak to the podium to introduce it to you.
Thank you. Anthony Ishak, town meeting member, precinct 1, and a pharmacist during the day. The reason I mention my profession is what I'm going to be discussing for a few moments is another public health crisis. I have no financial disclosures to bring forth today, but I do want to mention one personal aspect that impacts this bylaw proposal. My father immigrated to this country in the 70s, and one of his first jobs was working in a convenience store. He was held up, and thankfully, physically, he did fine. But the rest of his life, he had nightmares around that episode. My hope is this bylaw is the first step that we could take as a policy action as a municipality to bring down episodes with gun violence and guns in general to zero in our society. Slides, please.
Mr. Ishak, when did you submit the slides? There seems
Yesterday, and I received confirmation right away that said received.
okay. We found them.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So what you see here is a number of mass shootings that have occurred since January 29, when the concept for this bylaw was filed with town council. 224 plus. This was as of Friday, Friday, June the 2nd. That number has only gone up. Next slide, please. The goals of this warrant article are fourfold. One is to formalize a bylaw that's consistent with other existing policies around the US. Two is to reduce the risk of firearm injuries to children and the general public and to anyone in Brookline. Three, prevent possible anxiety from the presence of firearms to town staff and the general public. And four, to reduce the impact of firearms chilling the discussion of public policy, such as what we're doing today. Next slide, please. These are the current laws that are available or policies that could impact this. So currently, state law provides the banning of firearms on any educational environment, such as schools and universities. State houses and courts have their own policy, and Brookline currently has a policy for conservation and parks areas. Next slide, please. This is a summary. What you see in blue is what's known as blue states. What's in red is known as red states. This basically summarizes everything. Open carry, concealed carry, all sorts of states or municipalities have policies like this in place, looking at restrictions for firearms in parks and public buildings that are occupied by the governing group. Next slide. So this was discussed with town council, who I am so forever thankful for taking the time to edit this to what is the best document that we have at this point in time. Gifford's Law Center has provided their support for this article and has historically helped provide legal support for municipalities that have faced legal challenges. It was discussed with other town departments also. Next slide, please. Location restrictions were minimized to anywhere that's town property, with the exception of town housing, because there's multiple jurisdictions, and it exempts streets, sidewalks, and public byways. Next slide. Towns aren't preempted. There's cases to support the towns can take legal action against this. Next. So the US has the highest incidence of firearms injuries in the West. This proposes to reduce the risk by reducing firearms. The less firearms you have in spaces, the lower the risk of injury. Next slide, please. As you can see here, this is a 2021 poll that shows that a lot of people are worried about firearms, and particularly in the Northeast. It's the closest I could find the data to support this for New England. Next slide, please. These are notable groups that support actions like this, such as the Department of Justice and the American Association of Pediatrics. Next slide, please. There are case laws to support this, numerous case laws. This is also a key step for us to take as a municipality, as we would be the first in Massachusetts, and we could set a trend for how to make our parks and public areas safer. It also works very well with a proposal by our state rep, Tommy Vitolo, that's currently working its way through the State House to also help to improve the safety and the risks that are associated with firearms use. Next slide. So I would ask your support for this warrant article, joining the Select Board, the AC, and two of my co-petitioners who will be speaking in a few moments, and vote favorable action for this. Thank you for your time.
Jocelyn Murphy, could you please come to the podium?
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Good evening. Jocelyn Murphy, Precinct 16, speaking for the Advisory Committee, and with gratitude to Advisory Committee members Catherine Florio and David Mark Goldstein, whose work on the subcommittee contributed significantly to the main motion under this article. In Massachusetts, a license to carry firearms, or LTC, entitles its holder to purchase, rent, lease, borrow, possess, and carry handguns, rifles, and shotguns. The state police colonel and local licensing authorities, the chief of police in the town of Brookline, are authorized to issue LTCs. Until recently, the law in Massachusetts required a showing of good reason, which gave licensing authorities broad discretion in approving LTCs. However, in June 2022, the United States Supreme Court held in a landmark Second Amendment decision in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin that governments can regulate but not prohibit the public carrying of firearms by law-abiding citizens for purposes of self-defense. Following that decision, former Governor Baker signed House Bill 5163 into law, which amended General Laws Chapter 140, and Massachusetts, which previously had been a may issue state, became a shall issue state. And although the Bruin court said that firearms may be prohibited in so-called sensitive places, the court did not clearly define what other places other than, for example, government buildings should be considered sensitive, leaving those decisions to the lower courts. Warrant Article 1 seeks to amend Article 6.6 of the town's general bylaws by restricting where firearms may be carried in Brookline and by imposing a fine of $300 for those found to be carrying firearms in violation of these restrictions. As described by Mr. Ishak, the goals of the amendment are to reduce the risk of firearm injuries, to prevent anxiety among town staff and others related to the presence of firearms in the community, and to prevent the presence of firearms from intimidating participants and others during discussions of public policy in government buildings. In advancing their article, the petitions consulted with town council, the chief of police, the director of parks and open space, the chair of the Conservation Commission, and extensively with the Giffords Law Center, which has reportedly offered the town legal support should that become necessary. During advisory committee review of the article, the discussion centered largely on the restrictive and potentially confusing language that appeared in the original language of the article, along with concerns about whether the article would pass muster constitutionally and generate a legal challenge under the Bruin decision. One advisory committee member was concerned that the proposed amendment went too far by prohibiting the otherwise lawful carrying of firearms on all town-owned property, and proposed an amendment that would limit the prohibition to public buildings, voting locations, and parks and playgrounds. This narrower proposal was rejected by the petitioners. Another concern raised by the committee member was that although there was an exemption for town employees in the original article, there was no exemption for others, such as victims of domestic abuse who are explicitly authorized to carry firearms for self-defense. To address this, a recommendation was made to exempt others with consent from the chief of police in this section. Committee members were also concerned with the legally vulnerable reference to public ways in the article and with the requirement for signage, which would have required the installation of signage prohibiting the carrying of firearms throughout the town. In the discussion of these issues with the petitioners agreed that the signage requirement should be removed, and with support from First Assistant Town Council Moreski, who share the committee's concerns about a Bruin challenge, public ways were expressly excluded. With one exception, the changes recommended by the committee were adopted by the petitioners under a friendly amendment, which is now the main motion under Warrant Article 1. To be clear, it is possible that the proposed bylaw, even as amended, will not survive scrutiny under a legal challenge. However, the proposed amendments seek to achieve a satisfactory balance between the intent of the petitioners, the concerns that were raised by members of the advisory committee, and the mutual goal of both the committee and the petitioners of introducing a more easily interpreted bylaw that regulates the carrying of firearms in Brookline while also respecting the constitutional rights of properly licensed firearms owners. Finally, as Mr. Ishak has noted, State Representative Tommy Vitolo, along with Representative David Linsky, are co-sponsors of legislation seeking to limit the carrying of firearms in public places statewide. And the language in the Linsky-Vitolo bill inspired much of the language that appears in Warrant Article 1. I suspect you'll hear more from Representative Vitolo about that. By a vote of 22-0 with 3 abstentions, the advisory committee recommends favorable action on Warrant Article 1 as amended. Thank you.
Mr. Green?
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Bernard Green, Chair of the Brookline Select Board. And I'm speaking on behalf of, or instead of Miriam Ashkenazi, who could not be here. So I will read her presentation. First of all, the Select Board voted 4-0 in favor of warrant Article 1 of the special town meeting. I believe it was April 25th. This warrant article essentially bars carrying a firearm in any building owned by or under the control of the town, and at any gathering conducted on town property with certain exceptions. Why do we think we need this? Well, we know that stricter gun laws mean lower gun deaths. Massachusetts has the lowest gun ownership rate in the country, 14.7%. And subsequently, we have the second lowest gun death rate in the country at just 3.46 per 100,000 people. Gun control is an important public health issue, and strict policies around firearms is a vital role that our government can play. And since the federal government and Supreme Court won't do it, states and towns must do it. To be 100% clear, this is a public health issue, no different from the threat of tobacco, which is responsible for more than 480,000 deaths annually, for which Brookline has led the way in enacting cutting-edge public health policy. About 480,000, I think, is tobacco deaths. We should do the same here. In debating a special town meeting, Article number 1, the Select Board expressed general support for the aims of the proposed bylaw, although we did express some concern that a court might find it unconstitutional given the U.S. Supreme Court's increasing hostility to any restrictions on guns. We also noted that the bylaw has a severability provision that provides that any portion of the law not expressly found unconstitutional would survive such a challenge. This is an issue worth pushing the envelope on. So as I said earlier, Select Board voted 4-0 to recommend favorable action on the amended warrant article number 1. Thank you.
I now ask for Petra Binyami to come.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Petra Gospodnetic-Binyami, Town Meeting Member from Precinct 12. I'm also the current treasurer of the Town Meeting Members Association. Good evening, everyone. Every single one of us brings to this body and these deliberations our own life experiences. I grew up in inner city Richmond, Virginia, in the 70s and 80s, when it was ranked the highest murder rate per capita in the United States. Yesterday evening in Richmond, blocks away from where I grew up, 7 people were shot at a high school graduation. 2 of them died, including a student who had just graduated. Gun violence is a reality today, just as it was 40 years ago. Sadly, no one is immune. It's a risk and a fear we have to live with. Last night, Chairman Bernard Green reminded us that we are all privileged, and it's true. I feel especially grateful to be raising my children in Massachusetts and in Brookline specifically, where last Sunday I observed our community gathered around to celebrate our high school graduates, largely without fear. Similarly, I stand before you in this auditorium feeling a degree of protection, knowing that firearms are not allowed in this building per federal and state law. But if we had to move town meeting to a different location within Brookline that wasn't inside or adjacent to a school let's say we gathered in a place that didn't have those same protections, I would feel differently. If we held town meeting at town hall or the library, a Brookline field, under the current laws in Brookline, fire alarms would be allowed. This is why we've worked hard to formalize this bylaw and present it to you all this evening. This bylaw is a natural extension of the work I presented 18 months ago when we near unanimously voted to amend our zoning to regulate Brookline's land use with regards to gun businesses. Same as what you are voting on tonight, it was carefully crafted to proactively address what my co-petitioners and I saw as a concerning gap in Brookline's bylaws. I'd like to thank all of those who provided over 300 signatures to bring this to special town meeting, and especially to the members of the advisory committee, many of whom have spent hours alongside us over the last several months to bring this article in its current form. I expect and hope the majority of us will welcome this bylaw. Many of us dream of a world in which we don't have to fear gun violence. But until then, we can and we should be proactive and do whatever is possible to protect the safety and well-being of everyone in Brookline. Thank you.
Janice Kahn.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Janice Kahn, town meeting member from Precinct 15 and a co-petitioner of this special town meeting tonight. So I am cleanup. There's not really much more to say. There's a lot of interest and concern about gun regulations in Massachusetts right now. And this is the moment for Brookline to step up. You've heard that Representative Tommy Vitolo, along with Representative from Natick, David Linsky, have petitioned the general court to prohibit carrying firearms. This is House Bill 2359, and it's now in the Joint Committee on Public Safety and Homeland Security. And since this affects the entire Commonwealth, that bill is far more extensive. David Linsky has been long concerned with fire safety and has 8 other bills in this session, including updating the Massachusetts assault weapons ban, closing the loophole on large capacity magazines, requiring universal background checks for private gun sales, and raising the age for possession of a firearm from 18 to 21 with some exceptions. Our own Senator Cindy Cream also has submitted 4 bills regarding gun safety, including preventing the illegal trafficking of firearms, addressing firearms and firearm violence, and ghost guns. Other Senate bills include ones to strengthen gun control and address the illegal possession and sale of firearms. So this is our moment. While many municipalities have laws regarding the discharging of firearms, Brookline would be the first municipality in the state to regulate the carrying of firearms in sensitive places. So I urge you to please continue to support Brookline's leadership role in Massachusetts by voting yes on warrant Article 1. Thank you.
We will now vote on this article. A vote in favor of the article, it will be a recorded vote, would modify the bylaw as it is shown on supplement 2, pages 3 to 4, to add the provision that the carrying of firearms in Brookline is also illegal in various places, adding a definition and adding penalties. It will be a recorded vote and a majority will be required to pass it. And we will drop the voting now. The motion passes with 193 yes, 4 no, and 8 abstentions. I will now entertain a motion to dissolve the special town meeting.
Second.
It is so voted. Everybody in favor? Anybody opposed? Brave soul. Okay, we are now going to turn to Article 22, which is one of the simpler, easiest article I've ever had the pleasure of moderating, relating to ranked choice of voting. And I think one needs a degree in advanced mathematics or logic, but that may just be me. Anyway, it is Article 22. It is a motion brought by Scott Ananian and seconded by Mike Sandman, found on Supplement 2, page 22.1 to 22.4. And it asks the town of Brookline to adopt a ranked choice voting system to all town elections. And there is an amendment that has been submitted by Mr. Sandman, which is seconded by Mr. Ananian. It is found on Supplement 3, pages 1 through 5, and it would modify the original motion to eliminate town meeting elections from the ranked choice voting system. So as we begin, I will call Mr. Ananian.
Point of personal privilege.
Yes.
Hi, Madam Moderator, Shira Fisher, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 11. As someone who supports this, the ranked choice voting, it sounds like you are biased against it. I recognize that you will say maybe that you were just joking, but if the moderator thinks that this is complicated, maybe she should not be moderating if she's biased against it.
I think that I could find many people who would agree that it is complicated.
Madam Moderator,
the-
you're supposed to
No,
be
excuse me,
unbiased.
Excuse me. I am not commenting on the merits of it. So I take your point. Thank you very much. You can take your seat.
Point of personal privilege.
Yes.
Richard Nangle, 27 years. This is my first one. That statement was ridiculous. I disagree with it. Carry on.
Thank you. All right, Mr. Ananian, can you please take the podium?
Boy. Thank you. Hello, I'm Scott Ananian. I was expecting I'd be able to see my slides on the tablet here, so you'll forgive me if I have to look over my shoulder. I'm Scott Ananian, Town Meeting Member from Precinct 10, presenting warrant Article 22 on behalf of the Ranked Choice Voting Study Committee, which was appointed by the Select Board to fulfill the mandate of a 187 to 34 vote in November 2020's town meeting. The committee was charged to recommend best practices for ranked choice voting in town, and I am pleased to present the work of the committee here to you tonight. Next slide. Mr. Sandman will introduce the committee members a bit later, and you can find the committee's full report under Article 25 of the combined reports. It is also online at brooklinercv.org, along with the full results of the cookie voting for 5 nights of town meeting. Thank you, Mr. Karen. The main motion under this article proposes home rule legislation to adopt ranked choice voting for elections to town-wide offices. An amendment offers town meeting the choice whether to cover the election of town meeting members as well. To understand the benefits of ranked choice voting, let's look at a key problem in the voting system we use today. That's the problem of vote splitting. Sorry, next slide. Let's say that we are holding an election for favorite candy, like the sample elections you might have seen out by the town meeting cookies, and 2 candidates enter the race, Reese's Peanut Butter Cups and Necco Wafers. Next slide. Early polling shows about 60% prefer Reese's to Necco Wafers, so it looks like peanut butter cups will win handily. That is until, a third candidate decides to enter the race. Next slide, Reese's Minis. This is bad news for Reese's fans. Now their votes are split. Next slide. And on election day, Necco Wafers win. Next slide, with less than a majority, less than 50% of the vote. Next slide. Vote splitting has a number of negative consequences for our elections. First, as we saw in the example, it means that those we elect may lack majority support. Now, while non-majority outcomes don't happen in every election, the threat of vote splitting is ever present, and that threat causes prospective candidates to bow out of the race before it has even begun. Fewer candidates means a less diverse candidate pool. It means fewer campaigns drawing voters to the polls. In sum, it means campaigns are less welcoming, less inclusive, and less engaging than they could be. These are some of the problems that ranked choice voting can help fix. So how does it work? Next slide. Well, here are some of the ballots we see in town elections today. Depending on the number of seats we are filling, we may be asked to vote for up to 1, or up to 2, or up to 3. And as an election warden, I see this lead to confusion frequently. Article 22 would replace them all with, next slide, this ranked ballot where voters can choose, next slide, just 1, or if they want, next slide, mark a second choice in the second column, next slide, a third choice in the third column, as many or as few choices as they like. And it doesn't matter how many seats we are filling, 1, 2, or 3, the ballot and the instructions stay the same. To see how the votes are counted, let's look at a select board race between the 4 candidates on this ballot: Ruth, Ellen and William, Roland and John. Next slide. We start by counting just the first choices, just the marks in this first column. Next slide. Ruth has 42 first choices, Ellen/William have 23, Roland 10, and John 25. Ruth is in the lead, but with ranked choice, you can't win with only 42% of the vote. Instead, the last place candidate, and here that's Roland, is dropped. Next slide. And everyone that voted for Roland has their vote instantly count towards their next choice instead. Then we continue to drop the last place candidate, next slide, and transfer their votes until only 2 candidates remain. When only 2 are left, next slide, the candidate with more than 50% of the vote, a majority, wins the seat. Congratulations, Ruth. But what if we're filling 2 seats on the select board? Next slide. Well, the process is much the same, but the winning threshold instead of 50% is now 33 1/3% of the ballots cast. In this 100 ballot race, it rounds up to 34. Next slide. Ruth has already exceeded that threshold and is elected in first place to the first of 2 seats to be filled. But then we do something a little different. Next slide. Ruth got more votes than she needed to win the race, and we want to respect the second choice preferences of all of Ruth's voters. So we redistribute the second choice votes of all of Ruth's voters proportionate to the amount of Ruth's surplus over her threshold. In our example, that ends up giving Ellen and William 4 more votes, Roland just over 3, and John just under 1. We don't have a second winner over the threshold yet. Next slide. So now we proceed exactly as before. The last place candidate is Roland, so we distribute his voters' second choices or third choices, if their first choice was Ruth, to the other candidates. Next slide. Now Ellen and William are also over the threshold, and so they are our second place winner, filling the second of the 2 select board seats. Now, I'm happy to answer any questions about how the votes are counted, but it's important to keep in mind that regardless of the mechanics of the count, the task of the voter remains simple. Next slide, which is just to fill out this ballot. And we know that voters can handle this from experience around the country, around the world, and next slide, right here at the cookie table. In exchange for using ranked ballot and counting the votes in this way, town elections would see a number of benefits. Next slide. First, it will ensure the candidates we elect always have majority support. By ending vote splitting, it will encourage a larger and more diverse set of candidates to run. There's evidence that this benefits women and people of color in particular. It will help boost voter turnout because more candidates means more people pulling their friends and neighbors out to vote. It will limit gamesmanship because lobbying your supporters to bullet vote for you becomes an ineffective strategy under ranked choice. And 5, candidates will have an extra incentive to stay positive and civil to pick up the second and third choices from supporters of their opponents. Next slide. Ranked choice voting is already in use here in Massachusetts, in East Hampton and Cambridge. Acton, Amherst, Concord, and Northampton have approved or submitted home rule petitions this legislative session, including proportional RCV for multi-seat elections, just like Brookline's proposal, and with substantially similar wording, and that's no coincidence. And RCV is in the draft charter for the city of Somerville. Brookline and 2 other towns included RCV on their spring warrant. It is used at the state level in Maine and Alaska, and in 60 cities, including the most recent mayoral race in New York City. Next slide. In addition to town-wide offices, the main motion under warrant Article 22 would elect town meeting members using ranked choice as well. If adopted, Brookline would be the first town to adopt ranked choice for town meeting members. The study committee recommended the use of ranked choice for town meeting members because the representational benefits of proportional ranked choice voting increase as the number of seats increase. Although majority viewpoints are guaranteed a majority of the seats, it helps ensure that minority viewpoints get proportional representation. However, it was acknowledged that once a decade, redistricting years present a challenge. For the precincts affected, there may be races with 20-ish candidates on the ballot for 15 seats. Cambridge ranked choice elections frequently have this many candidates. In 2021, there were 19 candidates on the city council ballot, for example, and the ballot designs used by Cambridge are very reasonable. Article 22 also contains language specifically to aid the clerk in managing any large ballots which may arise. But in any event, town meeting will have the option to determine whether town meeting members are included in the proposal put to the voters. Next slide. So what is the impact of a yes vote? The ranked choice voting proposal, as put to the voters, would apply to town-wide offices, select board, school committee, moderator, clerk, library trustee, constable, and housing authority. And as we just discussed, depending on the will of town meeting members as well. I urge town meeting to vote yes on the main motion, amended or not. If town meeting votes yes on the main motion, and if the state approves the home rule legislation this year, then Brookline voters will decide whether to adopt ranked choice voting on the May 2024 town ballot. And if Brookline voters say yes, our first election using ranked choice would be in May 2025. Importantly, that means one, even if we vote yes, we'd still have nearly 2 years for more public education before ranked choice voting is ever used. And two, a yes vote is ultimately a vote to let Brookline voters have a say. In November 2020, over 70% of Brookline voters said yes to adopting ranked choice voting at the state and federal level. Please vote yes on the main motion tonight so that they can decide whether they want it for local elections too. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ananian. Mr. Gordon.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Neil Gordon, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 1, and a Brookline Constable, speaking for the Advisory Committee. Elections and election laws are serious business. They're not about cookies and candy bars. They're the central institution of democratic representative government. So let's be serious and let's be precise. RCV proponents distributed a flyer prepared and edited by a team that included members of the Ranked Choice Voting Committee, including the committee's chair. Among the errors, the flyer wrongfully stated, winners always have a majority of support. It's since been corrected, but petitioner erroneously said it tonight in his presentation. How do those who presumably know best in lobbying their own proposal get this basic element wrong? There's a formula for what's needed to determine a winner in a multi-seat RCV election. 1 divided by n+1, disregarding fractions, and then adding 1. The flyer's wrong on that too, where n is the number of winners. Here are the percentages, and no, it's not a majority. In most select board races, it's just over a third. The 33% cited in proponents' flyers is wrong. Just over a quarter for school committee, the flyer's wrong there too. Just over a fifth for library trustee, a bit more than a sixth for constable, and about a 16th for town meeting after redistricting. The combined reports included examples. I'll add my hypothetical select board race. 2 seats and 4 candidates, 2 each from policy opposite factions, 2 Brights and 2 Sunnies. Incumbents Bob and Sue, plus Bev and Sam. 65% of voters want Bob and Bev, 35 want Sue and Sam. Of 100 first preference votes, Bob gets 45, Sue 30, Bev 20, and Steve 5. Bob wins with 11 excess votes. That second preference all go to Bev, who now has 31. Last place, Steve is out. His second preference votes all go to Sue, who now has 35. Nearly 2/3 want Bev. She loses. Just over a third want Sue. She wins. Next year, 2 seats, 2 Brights, 2 Sunnies, and the same result. Proportional RCV. Mike Sandman said here last week, we need to respect the majority. Almost 2/3 want Brights, but Sunnies win half. And with our current system, where we get 2 first place votes, the Brights all win in a landslide. That's what the 65% majority wanted. Elections are about consequences, not compromise. And if the majority, nearly 2/3, wants Brights, Brights should win. Also with our current system, when voter preference shifts to Sunny, we can flip select board control in 2 years. With proportional RCV, it can take 3, because now, even with about half as much support, Bright still wins 1 of 2 seats every time. A further and stark example, constables. In 2016, 83% of Brookline voters chose Hillary Clinton. If that same percentage want kinder, gentler constables, dare I say, like me, but the rest want a law and order, camo-wearing, weapon-toting bully who campaigns on promises to crack down on jaywalking by day and execute no-knock warrants by night, the bully, backed by just 17% of the voters, will be a Brookline constable without oversight by the select board or anyone else. Town policies that regulate police officers don't apply to constables. Electing a road constable isn't a seat at the table. It's a clear and present danger. Want our library trustees to be book banners? Proportional RCV invites that. The banners need one vote over 20% in 3 consecutive years to control 25% of the library board. Proportional RCV isn't a prophylactic against extremism. It's an invitation to overrepresentation by extremists. The Ranked Choice Voting Committee proposed significant changes in how we elect our local officials, changes that committee members, including their chair, incorrectly describe. Let's not experiment with complicated changes and unintended consequences. Our current system, understood from childhood, serves us well. Applied to all Brookline elections by a vote of 23 in favor, 1 opposed, and with 3 abstentions, the advisory committee recommends no action on Article 22. If applied only to townwide elections by a vote of 19 in favor, 5 opposed, and with 3 abstentions, the advisory committee still recommends no action on Article 22. Thank you.
Mr. Sandman. Oh, I'm sorry. Mr. Warren is bumping you. You guys can duke it out.
Well, he's doing the amendment, sorry. Good evening, Paul Warren, speaking for the Select Board, and unrelated to this article. 15 days ago, I stood before you and I said it was nice to see you. I now stand before you and say congratulations for a productive, well-run, collegial, pretty much town meeting. We should feel good about it. Welcome back. The passage of Warrant Article 18 on November 2020 special town meeting led to the formation of the Ranked Choice Study Committee to consider potential pathways for adopting ranked choice voting procedures for town elections. The committee was charged with several tasks, including examining the feasibility and best practices for implementation of ranked choice voting, as well as issuing specific recommendations for ranked choice voting in Brookline in the form of a home rule petition. Article 22 asks town meeting to authorize the select board to petition the general court for a special act providing for the use of ranked choice voting in Brookline municipal elections. If the warrant article is approved by town meeting, the resulting bill by the legislature, it would then be subject to a townwide ballot for voter approval. Ranked choice voting would apply to any single seat election in which there were more than 2 named candidates on the ballot, and any multi-seat election in which the named candidates on the ballot exceeded the number of open seats. As Scott Ananian described, each ballot would allow the voter to rank the candidates in order of preference. For example, choice 1, choice 2, choice 3. Ballots are counted in successive rounds. In each round, candidates with the fewest first votes, choice votes, are eliminated, and the preferences of those ballots where the candidates have been eliminated are distributed to each voter's next preference until the person elected receives a majority of the vote or attains the calculated election threshold. Arguments by select board members in favor of the article included that ranked choice voting ensures each voter's intention is preserved in the event that their top candidate drops out or the race fails to secure enough votes. It was also felt that ranked choice voting could benefit candidates in the political minority that may otherwise have difficulty securing support compared to mainstream candidates. Concerns raised by board members against ranked choice voting included the risk that the complex vote counting methodology may lower confidence in election outcomes and decrease already low voter turnout. Concerns that complex ballot layout in multi-seat races may increase the number of ballots that are deemed invalid due to overvoting, or what's called concluded ballots due to incomplete ranking. And it was also felt that the application of ranked choice voting to Brookline seems like overkill and a bit of a solution in search of a problem. In a vote of 3-2, the select board is recommending no action on Article 22. Thank you.
Now, Mr. Sandman.
Mike Sandman, member of the Select Board, speaking on behalf of the Sandman Amendment, surprisingly. I want to say Mr. Warren was in the majority of 3 and I was in the minority of 2 on the Select Board voting for this, and I don't think I've ever heard a more balanced presentation by somebody who had to give both sides. So thank you very much. My job is different. I'm going to try to convince you to support ranked choice voting. So, oops, lost my, there we go. First of all, what is ranked choice voting? What problem does it solve? How does it solve that problem? And is that solution a feature or a bug, particularly with regard to minority candidates in the political minority? And then what about the Sandman Amendment? Next slide, please. The members of the committee are posted behind you. They included the town clerk, who assured us that the software and systems were available to implement this. It was perhaps the most diligent committee that I've ever served on in Brookline. I've been on a lot of committees. It was meticulous in going through models for ranked choice voting and very careful about trying to figure out which pieces of those models fit for Brookline. So thank you very much to the members of the committee. Next slide, please. An example of the problem. I'll repeat a little bit of what Scott said, but I want to give you some concrete examples that don't involve candy. In 2020, in the 4th Congressional District, that's us, in the primary, the winner got 29% of the vote, and the next highest candidate got 28%. A majority chose candidates with views similar to the runner-up. The candidate who was elected with 29% did not represent those views. Ranked choice voting probably would have changed that. Next slide, please. More. In Gore versus Bush versus Ralph Nader, the spoiler, in 2000, if Nader voters had been able to give Nader their #1 rank and Gore their #2, Gore might have won. Not certain. It's a state-by-state question, but the possibility is that Nader votes might have switched Florida, which was, as you know, won by just a few hundred votes by Bush. In 2021, in the Boston mayoral primary, there were 12 first-round candidates, and the rule is top 2 have a runoff. 3 Black candidates combined had the highest total, but none of them made the cut for the runoff. With ranked choice voting, the runoff might have included one of the Black candidates. Next slide, please. The solution to these problems, and you remember I started with what problem are we trying to solve? The solution is ranked choice voting. What we have now, you have one choice out of the 2, 3, 4, however many candidates there are for in a single seat, or in the double seat, you have 2 choices and so forth. What you would get is a ballot that looks like the bottom, And you could rank 1, 2, 3, 4 choices, whatever you choose. If you don't want to rank all 4, you don't have to. Next slide, please. Currently, winners in a one-seat election can get less than a majority. With 1 seat open, Eleanor Roosevelt wins with 36%. With 2 seats, Abigail Adams wins the 2nd seat with 28%. But what about the voters who chose Lincoln or Washington? With the current system, any second choice they might have had doesn't count. With ranked choice voting, Lincoln is eliminated and her number 2 votes are distributed to the remaining 3 candidates. If 9 Lincoln voters rank Washington number 2, she defeats Adams because Washington would have had more number 1 and number 2 votes than Adams. And some people say, wait, that's a problem. Adams got more number 1 votes than, than Washington. That, something wrong here. No, it's not, it's a feature, not a bug. The winner is the candidate who gets a majority, or in the case of 3 seats, more than a third, more than 34%, by getting number 1 votes and number 2 or number 3 or number 4 votes, whatever, from candidates who are eliminated because they got too few number 1 votes. Sometimes the top vote getter ends up not being elected. That is, I say again, a feature, not a bug. It gives preference to the number 2 votes and so forth of the people who voted for a candidate who lost early, was eliminated early. The advantages: the winner often needs the support from number 2 and subsequent choices, so candidates tend to seek broad support. More candidates are likely to run. The process encourages more diverse fields. It tends to boost voter turnout and makes bullet voting ineffective. Next slide, please. Is this too complicated for Brookline? I learned how this works in the 8th grade civics class in Worcester. Passed the test. All of my colleagues in the class did as well. We had ranked choice voting in Brookline. I will say that in 1949, when it went into effect in Worcester, a nine-member city council, there was 1 minority candidate, minority political views, who was a nut. And he managed to get elected because there were enough people who had gave him a first preference. That's the way the system is supposed to work. It gives minority candidates that opportunity. And in Brookline, finish in just a moment, a quote from the Heath School website, you can read it yourself. In June, we will hold 2 votes using ranked choice voting. The second vote will be to decide our school name. The school name vote will take place on June 8th and 9th. Respect 70.1% of Brookline voters who voted in favor of the statewide referendum. If you're nervous about including ranked choice voting for town meeting elections, please vote yes on the so-called Sandman Amendment and yes on the main motion that will result. If you are comfortable with town meeting members being elected by ranked choice voting, please vote no on the Sandman Amendment and yes on the main motion. Thank you.
Yeah. Mr. Harry Friedman. Mr. Friedman.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Harry Friedman, Precinct 12, speaking in opposition to the warrant article. Despite opposing the warrant article, I think there are positive things to say about ranked choice voting. It tends to edge out the extremes. You actually need votes from the center in order to win. An example, Sarah Palin not being elected to Congress in a race in which ranked choice voting was used. But the positive examples tend to take place in single winner elections. Mike Sandman's examples were single winner elections. It's true that 71% of Brookline supported the state vote on ranked choice voting, but we elect 1 governor, we elect 1 attorney general, we elect 1 treasurer, we elect 1 secretary of state. Each representative, each town elects Each House seat is for one person. Each Senate seat is for one person. These are single winner. That is not what's happening here in Brookline. If approved, RCB will occur in multi-winner elections, whether or not town meeting races are included or excluded. And for that reason, I think RCB's positive attributes fade away. What are the issues here? Issue number one is complexity. Ranked choice voting in multi-winner elections is mind-numbingly complex. Citizens have a right to know and understand something as basic as how their voting system works. One of the reasons RCB lost at the state level was that people didn't understand it. However, as I said before, the state proposal was for single winner elections. In those elections, explaining how ranked choice voting works is a piece of cake compared to multi-winner elections. Ranked choice voting is kind of neat from a political science point of view, but read the warrant article and try explaining it to your grandmother or to your parent or to yourself. Issue number two is transparency. Voters need transparency. The counting of ballots in a multi-winner ranked choice system is as far from transparent as you get. It is a black box, inexplicable to all but a few. When asked how the ballot counting works, the answer is the software does it. A system where the results can't be replicated if the electricity goes out is not a good voting system. Issue number three is an understanding of how the process works. Voters need to understand how to vote. The proponents will say that RCB is a learning process and that eventually voters will learn how to rank the candidates. That may be true, but will they be able to make a meaningful and intelligent ranking of candidates? I don't think so. No offense, but try ranking the library trustees, or the 5 constables who all run in the same year, or the 15 finalists in a town meeting race during a redistricting year. It is a recipe for voters making ill-considered, random choices, and that's not good. Issue 4 is gaming the system and propounding proportional representation as a supposed benefit. The proponents argue that RCB will limit gaming the system. That's a joke. RCB is one big game. In a 3-person race for 2 select board seats, 33% of the voters voting together as a block can win one of the 2 seats. If the other 67% of the town wants the select board to swing in a different direction, is it fair that it can't be accomplished? Proportional representation is and was a feature of elections in Israel and in Weimar Germany. Neither worked well. Extremes get elected and deadlock ensues. Issue 5 is how prevalent is RCB. Some other cities and towns use ranked choice voting in multi-winner elections. Cambridge does, Amherst and East Hampton, but the other Massachusetts cities and towns don't. And the rest of the United States, where there are tens of thousands of cities and towns and counties that don't use it. There's a reason for that, a good reason. Ĉu vi parolas Esperanton? That means, do you speak Esperanto in Esperanto? Esperanto is an invented language which, in the words of its creator, was supposed to reduce the time and labor we spend in learning foreign tongues and to foster harmony among different peoples. Sounds great. How is that working? RCB is the Esperanto of election law. It is totally unnecessary. It is a solution in search of a problem. It won't increase participation. It won't make elections and ballot counting easier to do or understand. It will simply muddy the waters and make what should be a simple task, voting, a complex one. You shouldn't need a PhD from MIT in order to figure out how to vote or count the votes. A lack of a PhD shouldn't disenfranchise any Brookline voter. Elections are more important than cookies. Please vote against the warrant article. Vote for or against the Sandman Amendment. I don't really give a darn. But whether or not the amendment passes, please vote no on the final vote.
Jay Schweitzer Shallot. One of our BHS students.
Good evening. My name is,
Wait, can we adjust
Yeah.
the microphone for him, please? Crouching's a definite disadvantage one.
is this better? All right. Good evening. My name is Jay Fletcher Sallet. I'm a 17-year-old precinct 10 resident. Thank you for the opportunity to comment. I'm a member of the Ranked Choice Voting Study Committee, but I am speaking in a personal capacity. Warrant Article 22, as you've heard, seeks to give the voters of Brookline a choice about whether to adopt ranked choice voting for town elections. I believe voters should be given this choice and should be asked this question on the ballot. Should Brookline use ranked choice voting in local elections? Given that an overwhelming majority, 70% of Brookline residents voted to implement ranked choice voting statewide with question 2 in November 2020, and given that town meeting established the ranked choice voting study committee by an even larger margin that same year, I think that we should at least entertain the possibility that Brookline voters will support implementing ranked choice voting in the town of Brookline. Let's give them the opportunity to make this choice on the ballot. There are many benefits of ranked choice voting: removing the spoiler effect, ensuring majority support, letting every voter fully express themselves, helping elect women and people of color, and more. Let's give voters a choice. Then, whether ranked choice voting passes or whether it fails, Brookline will truly have seen democracy in action. A yes vote is a vote to give the voters a choice. A no vote is a vote to deny the voters a choice. So please vote yes on the Sandman Amendment, then vote favorable action on Warrant Article 22, whether amended or not, for a fully democratic Brookline. Thank you.
My understanding is that Ariel Seufer is not available tonight. Is that correct? And I call on Nancy Daly.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Nancy Daly from Precinct 12. I served 4 terms on the select board, and I can tell you that, each of my years when I was up, there were two seats open, so candidates running for 2 seats. It's not easy to run townwide in Brookline, and I think even harder now that there's not a regular newspaper. It is for the candidate who has to do an awful lot of the work to get themselves elected to that somewhat thankless job. Figuring out how to get some people to make you your first choice and some other people to make you their second choice and so on. I think it's asking too much, and there certainly has been fewer candidates running than there were when I started. So I would urge you to vote no action on this. I do appreciate that it has some benefits, but I think it's just, it's hard enough to run townwide as it is with the more straightforward system that we have. Thank you.
Mark Penzel.
If you could all come up here in height order, it'd be very helpful.
Thank you, Chaz, and thank you, Madam Moderator. Mark Penzel, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 2. I drafted in large part the AC's combined report on this article, so if it confused you, I apologize. Now I speak only for myself in support of the Sandman Amendment. I was not a political philosophy major in college. It wasn't until my first year in law school that I learned of John Rawls and his theory of justice. Because of this article, I've revisited Rawls's ideas, in particular, the idea to use the original position and the veil of ignorance to formulate his conception of a just society. Despite the risk of getting it wrong in front of this highly credentialed audience, I want to briefly discuss these concepts and what I think is their relevance to tonight's discussion. In the original position, you are asked to consider which principles you would select for the basic structure of society, but you must select as if you had no knowledge ahead of time of the position you would end up having in that society. This choice is made from behind a veil of ignorance, which prevents you from knowing, among other things, your race, ethnicity, social status, wealth, gender, and crucially in Rawls's formulation, your or anyone else's idea of how to lead a good life. Ideally, this would force participants to select principles impartially and rationally. To me, this way of thinking means, at a minimum, that in considering whether or not to adopt some form of RCV or retain the current voting system, you must put aside any particularized concerns about whose ox might get gored if we were to adopt RCV in Brookline's current social and political alignment. For example, I've heard one Brookline voter state that had the proposed RCV been used in last month's select board election, the losing candidate might have won had she received a share equal to 1/3 + 1 of the first place votes, something that this voter did not like because one of his preferred candidates would have lost. In response, I'd say, imagine the shoe being on the other foot, where the political alignments have shifted and evolved to where your favored candidate or candidates now represent a sizable but minority position. Wouldn't you like a chance to have at least one of your candidates elected, so long as he could command a sizable majority? Or more starkly still, imagine yourself in the South in 1950, or even today. Is it right to insist that because the two white male candidates each could command a majority for the two available seats, the black female candidate getting 40% of the vote and those voting for her should be denied representation? I know that if I were designing a voting system from scratch, that is from Rawls's original position and behind a veil of ignorance, I would not design one where such outcomes were possible. It is for this reason that I support Brookline's adoption of RCV. For practical reasons, however, I currently support its application only to townwide elections as a first step. I therefore urge you to vote yes on the Sandman Amendment. Thank you.
Mr. Nangle?
I think we can keep it here. Richard Nangle, Town Meeting Precinct 15. Here's some lived experience. 5 years ago, when I ran for select board, I polled the race through Emerson College. The poll results were nearly identical to the election results. Bernard Green and Nancy Heller won the race decisively, both receiving more than 4,000 votes. I had 2,600. Voters used their 2 votes for Bernard and Nancy. I know that because I had the raw data. We asked the poll question twice, first vote and second vote. The results were tallied that way and showed me finishing second out of the 4 in the first round. I was nobody's second choice. The second round did me in. I finished last. Even though Donnell O'Neill finished last in the race, he was ahead of me as a second choice. If those results were accurate, under ranked choice voting, I could have been elected based on my first round showing if I eclipsed the margin of victory, 1/3 of the vote plus 1, even though a candidate finished well ahead of me through voter preference. Is that how we're going to do things now? If Article 22 passes tonight, the message to voters is that you don't get 2 votes when 2 seats are available anymore. Now, in 5 years since my race, the political landscape has radically changed at town meeting with a stacking of people elected in issueless campaigns who can't seem to grab the brass ring at select board. Progressives, I'm talking to you. If you want a seat at the table, earn it through a majority like everybody else. You are not getting a free pass to the select board. If you want to take your shot at single-family zoning, at the police department, and the rest of the things you do, then accept the verdict of the electorate when it disagrees. Tonight, it seems you've waved the white flag, but we're not changing the rules just because you think we should. The Washington, D.C. Democratic Party denounced ranked choice voting in a statement just last week. They wrote, RCV is part of a broader agenda to erode the influence of the strong Democratic base in the district. Can there be any more disenfranchised group in the United States than Washington, D.C. Democrats? Clearly, they do not want to be further disenfranchised. Some of you will mysteriously vote for this tonight. We likely know almost exactly who you are. To the rest, I say, there is no reason to join them.
Point of personal privilege. Over here, mic 1.
Yes.
Does anyone have any question why I'm having a point of personal privilege?
Same point of personal privilege.
Excuse me, I do not, that is not a point of personal
Okay.
privilege.
My point is that the last speaker spoke in a disrespectful way to a large number of people.
I agree. That is
And
about-
what do we do with that?
Yes.
Thank you. I don't know what to do about that other
No,
than
it is just noted.
hopefully it makes people think twice about those of us who support ranked choice voting as having a higher standard of morals and ethics than was spoken about us just now. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to make sure each side has had an equal number of speakers. I see the people lined up. I am going to call the next speaker, Alex Neary, and then I will take questions. Alex Neary? Okay, and we'll see what we have to do with the microphone for you.
Hello, and thank you all for your service to Brookline as town meeting members. My name is Alex Neary. I'm a former RCV committee member, and I'm speaking in a purely personal capacity. If you are a town meeting member who does not know whether RCV would be right for Brookline, I'm speaking to you as a voter. This article does not ask you to decide whether you personally support ranked choice voting or for town meeting to debate the studies that went into composing this warrant article. Voting favorable action on warrant article 22 simply says that you believe Brookline voters should be allowed to decide whether RCV is right for them, and if the voters decide to vote yes to the ballot box, to respect our decision by clearing a legislative way for RCV to take place. Democracy is important. Some members of this body may question the need for change and worry that RCV would be too complex for voters like me. Polling data in 2020, however, showed that a supermajority of your constituents felt RCV was not too complex. Knowing this, why would town meeting not let the voters have the question put before us? To voters, RCV makes sense. It is a popular idea in Brookline. Ranking is something we do all the time in our daily lives. For example, if you're choosing a wedding venue, we might put the locations in order of preference, hoping your first choice has the wedding date that you want. Imagine for a second, if we were allowed to pick only one wedding venue, then if that venue's booked, the wedding's called off. That's how our current system works today. Voters like RCV because it's honest, and this warrant article puts forward an honest voting system. When we can list our preferences and know that our vote will be counted, voters don't need to engage in what some have called strategic voting by bullet voting, or by voting only for who we think can win. These strategies are complicated for voters and unhealthy for a Brookline democracy. Warrant Article 22 is a step forward on the path toward a more stable and representative democracy. That is why I'm asking my town meeting members and all of town meeting to vote yes on the amendment, and most importantly, yes on the main motion to include town meeting members. Voting yes will allow voters to decide whether RCV will work for us here in Brookline. Thank you.
I am going to now call on people waiting in line. I'm going to call first on the two people who I saw first, and then I will go by microphone numbers, i.e. one where there's no one except a photographer. 1, 2, 3, 4. But first, Ms. Thal, I believe you've been waiting.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Carolyn Thal, Precinct 16. My question is about how voters would be educated and informed about this system, which I'm hoping and assuming that the committee discuss and somebody might be able to address.
Hold on. Could you please hold on 1 minute? I need to determine who should address that. Okay, Mr. Ananian, could you please address that? I was going to ask the town clerk and he
I was also going
threw
to
it
suggest.
right
the
over to
clerk.
you.
Would you mind answering that?
No, he threw it right over.
Trying to avoid the long walk. Thank you, Ben Kaufman, the town clerk. It was something that was discussed in the committee, and the committee made a series of recommendations to the town clerk for community engagement and education, while also giving my office the flexibility to utilize our expertise and the resources that are available to us to do outreach. So we would plan on doing a significant amount of outreach, including direct mailings to voters, events throughout the town where we would educate voters, as well as working with the registrars of voters, the League of Women Voters, and other organizations to host trainings in public settings to try to make sure that everybody understands. I think especially with vote by mail, we'd make sure that there was a lot of information and materials included with any mailed ballot.
Thank you.
Mr. Kaufman, you may want to stay down there for a little while. Yes, the woman at microphone number 4.
Hi, this is Vina, Precinct 4. I had 2 questions. What if you decide only to put one person's name down? How does it work? Is it that's it? If you just do one, it doesn't go to another person? How does that percentage get split up?
What is your other question?
And my other question is what if you have 4 people on the ballot and you want 2 people to be number 1, and then you choose the other 3 as 2 and 3?
Mr. Ananian? I would also sit in the front seat and stay there.
Sorry about that. I am going to have to ask for the question to be repeated if you don't mind.
Not at all. It's fine. So let's say you want to just choose one person. If there's 2 or 3 people on the ballot and you just choose one person, how does it get split up? Is that it? You just have that one?
That's just it. Yep. You can vote
That's
for
it.
as fewer as many or as few as you like.
Perfect. And then what if there is 2 people, let's say the question is choose 2 out of the 4, but you choose, you want 2 people being number 1 and then 3 and 4 for the other 2, or 2 and 3.
You do have to rank one as your first preference and the other is your second. So reach deep into your heart and figure out which one is slightly nicer. But you can, I will say in the past select board race as a warden, I saw a lot of people filling out 3 bubbles for the spots. We see overvotes a lot. If you fill out all 3 rankings, that's fine as well. So you can fill out fewer rankings than our candidates, more rankings than our candidates. They're both fine.
Does that mean that your percentage goes higher if you only vote for 2?
No, it doesn't.
Okay.
Mr. Englander.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Scott Englander, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 6. And I have 2 questions. So if you want to take them together or one at a time, whichever. First is that I am curious about the prospects in the state legislature of this home rule petition, should it pass here, or even a bill for statewide ranked choice voting. Perhaps the moderator is aware of someone here with professional experience in the
Mr.
legislature.
Vitolo, start heading down this way, please.
The second is that, well, first, I find the motivation for ranked choice voting really compelling, and it seems to be a no-brainer for single seat elections. When it comes to multi-seat elections, I'm a bit confused by some of the language and just discovered what might be an error today when I reread it. So I'd like some clarification on this.
Okay, Mr. Vitolo, you are up first.
Okay.
Relating to, Mr. Englander, why don't you repeat the question?
Well, so the first one is, what are the prospects for either this home rule petition, should it pass, or for a broader statewide ranked choice voting bill?
Representative Tommy Vitolo, town meeting member at large and vice chair of the Joint Committee on Election Laws in the Massachusetts Legislature. Before I answer that, I am going to help the new town meeting members know that I abstain in all home rule questions, since it then becomes my job to carry the will of town meeting, amended or not, into the legislature. So for those folks who are new this year, welcome, and I will be abstaining from this vote. It's true that 70% of Brookline voted for RCV in partisan single winner elections very recently. It's also true that the overwhelming majority of my colleagues represent districts that voted against. I expect that they think first about their district and second about the Commonwealth before they think third about Brookline. I'm sure they all think of Brookline third, but I suspect they think of their own district first and the state second. And so whether or not they use a ranked choice system or not, I don't think they get to, let's go ahead and give Brookline what it wants, even though what it wants is different from what the rest of the state wants and from what their own constituents want, even though it would only be for Brookline. So the committee will consider it. There are several bills. It was erroneously suggested that Amherst has ranked choice voting. They do not, but they got a bill. They're trying. And the legislature has not allowed any community to have ranked choice voting since question 2 failed at the ballot. Maybe this year will be different. If this body passes a home rule, I will advocate for it as such. But recent history suggests a challenging road ahead.
Thank you. So back to my second question. The section on the language in particular that I want to ask about is section D, paragraph D, subsection 2, which says if at least one continuing candidate has more votes than the election threshold, then all such candidates shall be elected. Shouldn't it read if at least one continuing candidate has greater than or equal to, has votes greater than or equal to the election threshold, then all such candidates shall be elected? Take a 2-seat election, for example, with 100 votes. So the threshold would be 34 votes. More votes than the threshold, as this subsection requires, would be 35 or more. So that means that any candidates with 35 votes or more would be elected, right? But shouldn't it be 34 votes or more instead? A 1 vote difference in the calculation might seem inconsequential, but I don't know, a few years ago, a Boston city councilor was elected by a margin of 1 vote. So I'm asking for an opinion on whether this is an error or that's how it should read. Should it read as it does or say greater than or equal to?
Mr. Ananian, can you please come to the main podium to answer that? And then take a seat next to whoever you like in the front row.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I guess I'm more of average height. So I do apologize. It was one of the reasons I was running back from the back of the hall trying to get you an answer to your question, Mr. Englander. I love your first name. But in the hour or so before town meeting when you sent this, I haven't gotten a definitive answer, but I will read to you this brings me back to some history of the study committee, because the very first thing that we discussed in the study committee back when we were formed is actually the first words of the motion tonight, that the town authorizes the select board to petition a general court, blah, 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 and authorize the general court to make any revisions that are necessary or appropriate to the form of such bill. So I don't yet know if there is an error or not, but if there is, probably another number of other towns have very similar language. But this is also why we have our esteemed colleague from the general court who could make any Scrivener's corrections like that if necessary. There are a number of different forms for home rule petitions. We deliberately chose the one that does allow modifications of this sort. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I believe Ms. Gilman was waiting, and now I'm just going to go in order of microphones.
Thank
So-
you, Madam Moderator. My name is Jane Gilman, Precinct 3. I want you please to check my understanding. If ranked choice voting is in place, it could be that someone I didn't vote for gets my vote, because it would be allocated. So I vote for candidate A because I don't choose candidates B, C, or D. I prefer candidate A. But if let's see how it would go. If the candidate A doesn't have over 50% or whatever the threshold is, I'm a little confused by Mr. Englander's response Mr. Englander got. Then candidate C or D votes would go up to a candidate with the requisite number of votes, even though I didn't vote for that individual, and maybe I had good reason not to. Thank you.
Mr. Ananian?
No, it was never correct that your vote is never transferred to someone you didn't vote for. So I can assure you about that. If you only place one vote, that is the only person that your vote will count for. It will never be transferred to someone who you didn't select as one of your choices on your ballot.
Thank you.
Microphone 2.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Isaac Silverberg, town meeting member and constable, town meeting member in precinct 17. I appreciate my fellow constables note that precision is very important while we're discussing this. And one other member of the advisory committee's testimony actually left me with 2 questions that I wanted to make sure we could correct, because I believe them to be factually inaccurate. Is the Worcester City Council made up of one person, or is that a multi-person body? There was a reference that all of Mr. Sandman's examples that he used were for single winner elections, and I don't believe that to be true. The second question is, I believe, to the clerk, but it might be to Mr. Ananian, in that is our system that we're proposing able to be hand counted or audited after the fact if someone wishes to, examine the veracity of the election that we have conducted?
Okay, I'm not sure about your first question, asking about was it Worcester?
Yeah, it would be news to me if all of Mr. Sandman's examples were for single candidate winning elections, but that's what was asserted.
Okay, well, that's a fact that can be checked later. So, and I'll let the town clerk answer the question of whether or not, well, no, the issue is whether or not the town has the capacity to do that, or whether Mr. Ananian will be there and counting the votes.
Thank you, Ben Kaufman, the town clerk. We do have the ability to go back and run an audit or a check on our ranked choice voting ballots. The machines that we we procured new machines last year. The company also has experience running ranked choice voting. Most notably, they're the election equipment providers for the state of Maine, which uses ranked choice voting. So we would be able to do recounts or to do an audit on it. There are two ways that we can do that. One of them is to run it back through the machines, which would be fairly easy and consistent to do. The other option is to do a hand audit or a hand recount, which would take considerably more time, especially in comparison to our current system, in order for us to go back into hand recount or hand audit a ranked choice voting election.
So just to absolutely put this to bed, there is no element of randomness to this, and this is an election result that we can go back and check and verify after an election has been conducted under this proposed system.
That is correct.
Thank you very much, Mr. Clerk.
Microphone, do you have a point of order?
I would like to respond to his first question.
No, I'm sorry, you can't do that. Thank you. Microphone 3.
Michael Rubenstein, Precinct 13. Madam Moderator, would you be willing to allow Mr. Sandman to correct his slide claiming that Abigail Adams wins with less than a majority, given that 28 votes were given by 50 voters who each had 2 votes to give to candidates, and 28 divided by 50 is greater than 50%?
Okay. Do you have access to Mr. Sandman's slides so we can re-examine his mathematical ability?
If I'm wrong about this, I shouldn't have passed that test in the 8th grade. But there were 100 votes.
Or should we just concede the possibility that his math was incorrect and move on?
Well, there were 100 votes, and so 28 votes is 28% of that, as far as I recall. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have a lot of questions, and we should just accept the possibility that the math was incorrect or correct. You're going to make a point of order or a question of privilege related?
Well, I
to
guess it's point of privilege.
mathematical ability?
There was a question asked about the Worcester City Council. There are 9 members of the Worcester City Council that are ranked, and the ballot includes all of them and everybody else running.
Okay, person at microphone 4, please.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. John Hebert, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 7. Given the confusion over the mathematics of what's going on here, one has to wonder about the statistic that's given out in the flyer as we were entering the building. About 70% of the Brookline voters voting favorably for ranked choice voting. Number one, given the fact that there's usually only 30% of registered voters who vote in any election, 70% of that 30% would only be 21% who were actually for it. And one wonders what they really knew about it. Curiously, there's been no mention in the promotional literature about the 4-year preclusion to challenge ranked choice voting by either town meeting or, as I understand it, by popular vote once it has been implemented, which I find rather difficult to put something in place that by law, apparently, we can't change. Also, in the subject of the vote that was taken in the election in Alaska, there's a good article in a publication called The Hill, which my understanding is it's perhaps a bit right-leaning, but my understanding is that it is more centrist. The title of which is "The Flaw in Ranked Choice Voting, Rewarding Extremists."
I'm sorry, if you have a question, that's fine. If you're making well, you may continue for a short period.
Thank you.
But then I also understand you to be asking for an explanation, a greater explanation of the 4-year aspect of being locked in. That was in the motion that has not yet been discussed.
No, Madam Moderator, really, this is merely a comment against ranked choice voting.
Okay.
May I continue?
Yes.
Thank you. In the Alaska election, according to this article, which is written by a couple of credible authors, it says ranked choice voting makes it more difficult to elect moderate candidates when the electorate is polarized. For example, in a 3-person race, the moderate candidate may be preferred to each of the more extreme candidates by a majority of voters. However, voters with far left and far right views will rank the moderate candidate in second place rather than in first place, and so on. It then goes on to describe the election that took place in Alaska. And so with 3 candidates, and the person who was declared the election winner didn't actually receive the largest number of votes. The authors analyzed the anonymized voter data made public by the Alaska Division of Elections, a data set that included the complete ranking of candidates for every scanned ballot in the election and comprises over 99% of the total votes counted. They say, we found that this person, Begich, won head-to-head contests against Peltola, the winner, by over 8,000 votes, and against Sarah Palin by over 38,000 votes. What they suggest that should be done is locales interested in holding elections with more than 2 candidates should use a different vote counting system. The last comment that I will make is that the entire premise of ranked choice voting that the committee was charged to study is the potential options for adoption for town elections. And then it says the goal of the committee should be to recommend best practices for ranked choice voting in town. I would contend, or I would feel much more comfortable if the committee recommended best practices for voting rather than best practices for one way of voting. Thank you.
Mr. Benka?
Dick Benka, Precinct 14. I'm following up on Nancy Daly's comment. I served with Nancy on the select board. I ran twice and was elected twice. And even back then, it was grueling and it was expensive. And my question is the following. Petitioners cite as an advantage of ranked choice voting the fact that it, quote, broadens the base candidates must capture to win. This, it would seem, would give an advantage to wealthy candidates or those with wealthy supporters so that they would have the ability to get their name out more broadly among the electorate. My question is, has there been any analysis done of the likely impact of ranked choice voting on the cost of running for townwide office in Brookline?
Mr. Ananian?
That's a good question. There has not been any formal study. I've been involved in a lot of campaigns over the years, and I can assure you that some of them can be quite expensive. The goal is to allow more voices to be heard, and hopefully to allow some of the candidates to combine forces isn't the right word, but the idea is if you're going around canvassing for a smaller candidate, you're also going to be talking to folks about second choices and third choices. And similarly, if you're talking to, if you're going around canvassing for a larger candidate, and they say, yes, but I really want this person who maybe might not get a majority share, then you're going to be talking to them about their second choice and third choice. So in some sense, it ought to make an election dollar go a little further because people are going to be talking about more choices rather than just a single candidate, but there hasn't been any study done as far as I know. Thanks.
Mr. Nanian, who is the chair of the ranked choice voting committee?
That is me. I am, sir. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I was going to say moderator. Microphone two.
Thank you. Bitsy Perlman, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 6. So I had, I guess, a question based on my experience living in Cambridge. I've heard a lot of people say today that they think it would be more complicated to vote in a 15-member or a 15-part election where you have potentially 20 people on the ballot for ranked choice voting other than this. And I wondered, whether this is true. So my experience living in Cambridge is that because of the proportional representation nature of this, you really only have to consider your sort of top 4 choices because you're unlikely to really get down below choice number 4 or choice number 5, given the sort of proportional representation. And if you have 15 seats, right, the bar is very low. And so I was curious whether, this seemed to be correct, because this is my experience living in Cambridge, what it was like. Actually much more accessible and much easier.
Mr. Ananian? Would you like the question to be repeated?
Yes, please, Madam Moderator. I wasn't
Next.
aware there was a question. I'm sorry.
Okay, Nix Perlin.
So the question is, given in a 15-person election, with say 20 people, like how likely is it, or is it even possible to get down below your 5th ranked person?
In an election with 15 candidates for 5 spots?
No, an election with 20 candidates for 15 spots.
Yeah, I mean, if there's only 20 candidates, if you look at the results for the cookie elections, for example, typically what you end up doing is progressively reducing, taking out the lowest ranked candidate. So if there's 20 candidates, you're probably going to have 5 rounds of eliminating those 5 choices. And if that's, that leads with, if that gets you to your 15 winners, then you're never going to look past the 5th choice of,
Right.
the person.
So in some ways, you only have to consider ranking your top 5 people and not really like how to vote on all 15 in that case.
I mean, the beauty of the ranked choice voting system is every bit of information you give to on the ballot can be used and could, the thing we always say as election wardens is every vote could count, right? So it could come down to your 15th preference in an election. And if you fill out the whole thing, all of that intent will be reflected in the tabulation. Thanks. I can also give the election numbers for the November 2020 question 2 election, which was asked.
No, thank you.
Okay.
Mix Frawley, or Ms. Frawley, sorry.
Whatever. Regina Frawley from Precinct 16 and also a constable. I have 3 concerns. We've noticed in the past 2 years in particular that there's now a movement towards slates, SLATES. And people are joining their resources to run as a slate. How could this not work with something like this? And I don't approve of slates, by the way. I happen to think you should be able to vote for individuals you've learned to have a feeling about and a thought about. Second point, I really got turned off with the word that we're going to be going to a ballot, because I just saw a ballot question on the Pierce, and which only won by a few hundred votes, and people who said, oh, it's only 300 votes, they were called deniers, election deniers. And yet the article on marijuana was 11 points above the average, and it didn't come through. The ballot was not honored. So I don't know how the ballot would play in this, because I can never go to my constituents ever again and tell them I trust the ballot process, because they already have weighed in on what a disgusting thing has happened. Last but not least, and it's humorous, but really raises a question. My worthy colleague, A. Barrett, was behind me, and he didn't want to be behind me, so he moved to a different microphone, and lo and behold, he got ahead of me. So I have to be concerned how this whole ranked choice can be played and gamed. Thank you very much.
Mr. Rodrigo.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Carlos Friedrejo, Precinct 14. I had two questions, probably for Town Clerk. First question is, I'm assuming that in some elections where there's maybe 2 ballot questions and a full slate of election or possibilities, that this type of voting would take more space on the ballot. And I was wondering if there would be ever a situation where you would have to go to a second page or a longer page, or how is that resolved and what's the cost about that?
Mr. Kaufman, yes, you may. You're
Thank
ready.
you, Madam Moderator. Ben Kaufman, the Town Clerk. Yes, when you do ranked choice voting, because you have to lay out the actual grid, it takes up significantly more space on the ballot than how our ballots are normally set up. So it would likely take up more space. We have the ability to make our ballots longer, anywhere from 11 inches, which if you were in precinct 16, you saw an 11-inch ballot back on May 2nd and May 30th, all the way up to a 21-inch long ballot. The longest that we have had so far was a 19-inch ballot last year, which was really tight for some of those races. And that was the year we did not have any ballot questions. So with ranked choice voting, it is likely that we would have ballots that go onto either the back of the ballot or even onto a second entire sheet. The financial cost of that, we'd have increased printing costs from our vendors in order to print it, as well as likely increased mailing costs when it comes to vote by mail, because our envelopes with the ballot inside would be heavier because of a heavier paper stock, which is a couple of cents times 8,000 ballots that we mailed out this last election would be an additional cost.
Thank you. My second question is, for example, say that someone got confused about the instructions and they did vote for at least 2 people under number 1, and then they skipped 2 and then 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I'm assuming that race, that ballot for that race would be invalidated. What is the percentage? Well, first of all, is that true? And second of all, what's the percentage of invalid votes or ballots that you have with the current system?
Yes, so Ben Kaufman, the Town Clerk. If somebody were to vote the same for 2 different people under option 1, that would be an invalid ballot. We consider that an overvote is the terminology that we currently use. In that case, we count the ballot for that race as being a blank. We will still count all of the other races, but for that race, we would consider it a blank vote. Which is the current process that we use in our elections. We actually do not report out our overvotes independently. Our voting software lumps them in with the other blank votes. So normally we wouldn't have that information. I will say we did have that this past election due to a potential recount. We actually went back to our vendors and were able to get that data. And on the select board races last year, I believe it was in the 30s of how many people we had whose votes were considered an overvote. A thing I will note is when the ballot is going into the machine and the machine detects an overvote, it will actually stop the ballot and notify the voter and give them the opportunity to get their ballot back, spoil it, and get a replacement. That only works if the voter is actually there voting in person. If it's a vote by mail ballot, then the poll worker is instructed to just cast the ballot through and cast it as a blank. But if it's a situation where a voter is voting in the precinct, they would have the opportunity to get their ballot back and make a correction.
Thank you.
Mr. Lepson.
Hi, good evening. Robert Lepson, Precinct 9. A process question. I'm trying to understand and grasp what we're actually being asked to vote on tonight. So if town meeting approves either the Salmon Amendment or the main motion or both or whatever it is, what happens next? So, and I think Mr. Schweitzer Shallot was alluded to this. We then go, this is a home rule petition that goes next. And then if the home rule petition comes back, then it goes to the voters for a referendum. Does it the opposite direction? So we're not actually voting on ranked choice voting. We're voting on something else, on a process that may eventually lead to ranked choice voting. Do I have that correct?
Can somebody help explain what the actual process is and what we are actually voting on tonight?
Mr. Vitolo seems quite anxious to answer that question.
Representative Tommy Vitolo, town meeting member at large and vice chair of the Joint Committee on Election Laws. If town meeting passes this warrant article, the next step is to the select board, who then votes on whether or not they would like to send it to the Great and General Court. If they vote affirmatively, it goes to the town clerk. Where is he? He's over there, who has to notarize it and send it on special paper, which then comes to my office and Senator Cream's office. One of us, not both, just one of us, then file it where it goes to the Joint Committee on Rules, where it waits until it gets released into, presumably, the Joint Committee on Election Laws. It will then have a public hearing. After the hearing, the Joint Committee on Election Laws, upon recommendation from the chairs, will vote to send it along favorably with amendments, send it to study, or give it a disfavorable report, which is exceedingly rare. If it gets a favorable ruling, it then goes on to third reading, where it sits until the Joint Committee on Third Reading chair, the House chair and the Senate chair independently, decide to bring it to the order of the day. And when it gets to the order of the day, it sits until the speaker decides to bring it to the floor. And if the speaker brings it to the floor in the House, and the House votes favorably, and if the Senate president or whoever's running the meeting in the Senate, I don't quite know how the Senate works, brings it to their floor and they vote favorably, and if the language is identical, it then goes to the governor. And if the governor signs it, then it's law, it's session law. And at that point, we're teed up for this vote of the people. And if the people vote yes, then it goes into effect. Now, there's two extra details, though.
Wait, it goes into effect. Town meeting does not need to reapprove it?
Correct.
Got it.
There's two extra details, though.
Yeah.
The first is the preamble on the home rule allows the legislature to change any of the language. And so if the legislature changes any of that language, everything that happens after that could be different. So for example, the legislature could say, we don't want the good people of Brookline to vote on it. It's a little much on the process. We're just going to put it into law. That's possible. It's also the case that they might remove the part that says if Brookline wants to take it out of law later, they can, because in fact, the legislature really does not like, typically, there's always exceptions. The legislature does not like when they pass a home rule for anyone else to have the authority to change it later. And this language does have that. So it could take that out as well. And so to the best of my ability, that's the process. Welcome to Schoolhouse Rocks, state legislature style.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a point of order. Microphone one.
Yes.
If I understood that right, every comment about whether I like this or not is not in the scope of the article. The article is only whether we're going to give the voters the right to choose, and it's not about my opinion. It's just whether my opinion is that people should have the right to choose. Is that wrong?
Yeah, no, that's not a point of order. I mean, scope is not your decision. Scope is in the moderator's decision.
Okay.
That was entirely within the scope because what we are going to be voting on is whether or not to approve a home rule petition.
No, I agree with that. I meant all the other comments about whether
Excuse me,
I like it or not. I'm sorry, just clarifying what I
I'm
meant.
sorry, I made my decision about scope. I appreciate your point of order, but I am denying it. Thank you. And we are moving on to microphone number 2.
Thank you. Liz Linder, town meeting member, precinct 4. I have a comment. Ranked choice voting clearly includes interesting ideas. It's an interesting debate, but it's complicated, confusing, and accessibility, in other words, to my mind, are thrown around pretty subjectively here. Democracy, as we know it, is imperfect, but when I hear people talk about being truly democratic and using that as an argument to change the way we vote, I wonder what that implies. We're all currently participating in democracy right now. It strikes me that ranked choice voting could support extreme views on any side. It's also not comparable to choosing cookies or selecting a wedding venue. It's completely different. And it's, that to me is a poor sales tool for this. The miscalculations embedded within ranked choice voting arguments to me are a red flag. Also, I want to just share a footnote, an interesting footnote from a colleague who studied political philosophy around the John Rawls perspective that was referenced earlier, the theory of justice. Rawls is a derivative of Immanuel Kant, a great 18th century German philosopher. One of the most cutting comments my colleague has ever heard seen in a book review of Rawls's theory of justice notes that it said it was, quote, partly new and partly good, which is why the dialogue seems to be revealing that given the complications and confusion involved, especially for ballots with multiple candidates, it's not the right time or place for ranked choice voting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Jonas.
Hi, Elisa Jonas, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 16, member of the Advisory Committee, speaking on my own behalf. I had thought that I was in support of ranked choice voting, but my approach to ranked choice voting apparently is the board account, which is you give, if there's 5 people running and you choose number 1, you choose X as your first choice and Y as your second choice, then that gets 5 points, the next one gets 4 points. And apparently there's many different kinds of ranked choice voting, or I don't know if there's many, but thanks to this Warren article, I've been enlightened that there's more than one, and that this one is called the Condorcet method, according to Scott. I think he can correct me if I'm wrong. But I have been trying very hard to understand this system. When I was at the advisory committee meetings, I read very carefully what the descriptions were. And just again today, I asked for Neil Gordon's notes to see if that could help me get the information clarified. So I have 2 rather big concerns about the proposal to have ranked choice voting. One is that I don't think people are, when they are voting yes or no for ranked choice voting, they don't know what they're really voting for, because I think the approach that I thought was ranked choice voting would come out with a different outcome than the one that's currently being proposed for Brookline. And the other problem is just, I don't think people are going to be able to understand how they're voting on with this method. But I do have a question. If ranked choice voting it wins and it gets to the legislature, is there going to be an option presented to you to do other kinds of ranked choice voting, or is it the one that's currently being proposed at town meeting? No, I guess you've already said the
Actually,
legislature can change.
I'd first like to
Anything.
let Mr. Vitolo address the issue of will it be the same, but I'd also like to give Mr. Ananian a chance to respond to what you were talking about in terms of what we are actually voting on.
Tommy Vitolo, Town Meeting Member at Large and Vice Chair of the Joint Committee on Election Laws. Typically, the legislature tries to change as little as possible to make the bill work. And so I would not expect the legislature to switch to the AP college football voting method or some other method. I would expect them to correct Mr. Englander's concern, because in fact, he was right. The language in the bill is wrong. The threshold must be met or exceeded. The language in the bill says exceeded. It is wrong. And I would hope that the state legislature would forgive Brookline for sending them bad math and correct it.
But actually, what I was actually wondering is if the people were to vote, if it comes to a ballot question, I would hope, and I'm wondering, will it be clarified exactly what type of ranked choice voting is being selected and that there are other alternatives and this is the one.
Thank you. Scott Ananian, Chair of the Ranked Choice Voting Study Committee. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier, Madam Moderator. This is the version of ranked choice voting being put forward by every major electoral reform advocacy group in the country. And the one that jurisdictions around this country at least use, the one that's in use in Maine, for example. The language in our warrant article is very similar to the language that was approved by the town meetings of Acton, Amherst, Concord, and Northampton, including the use of proportional RCV for multi-seat elections. It is slightly different from the one used in the city of Cambridge, which is frankly pre-computer, and so it uses a set of what we would call antiquated methods. But every modern ranked choice voting system in the country uses a Condorcet method, and all the home rule petitions that are currently being brought in the state of Massachusetts use language very similar, if not identical, in many places to the petition you have before you tonight.
The language or the particular method is the same.
Well, I mean, both, yeah. So the particular method and even down to the exact definitions of things like election threshold, which, and again, I apologize because this was sort of brought on me surprise, but it would not be a terrible surprise to me to find that typo, as it were, greater than versus greater than or equal to, more or less, was in other warrant articles. And again, that is the reason that we give this discretion to both our select board in bringing the warrant article to the general court and to our legislatures. And again, just to compliment Mr. Vitolo, there are more strict versions if you don't trust your general legislature to do the right thing. And we deliberately chose the one that gives Representative Vitolo a great deal of discretion.
Ms. Khan.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Janice Khan, town meeting member from Precinct 15 and also a member of the advisory committee, but asking this question for myself. So for most of us sitting in this room, ranked choice voting is academic and theoretical. But there are people who have lived experience with this. And so I was curious by Mr. Sandman's comment about learning about ranked choice voting in 8th grade. And so I looked actually at the results of the state vote on ranked choice voting and was surprised to see that that Worcester actually rejected the state ballot. So I was just wondering whether Worcester still has ranked choice voting or whether they have reconsidered it for themselves or they use it only under certain circumstances.
Mr. Sandman.
Mike Sandman, Select Board, former resident of Brookline, of Worcester. Beg your pardon. That was close.
Yeah, town
former
council would have a big problem with, with this otherwise.
I did live, yeah, that's right. I did live in Cambridge briefly. Worcester had ranked choice voting from 1949 to 1960. It was given up because of the complexity of counting it in the days when the entire armory floor, the National Guard armory floor in Worcester, was covered with desks and people counting pieces of paper. Worcester changed a great deal since I left because, after all, I left. It has not gone back to ranked choice voting.
Microphone one.
Good afternoon. My name is Natalia Linos, town meeting member, Precinct 6, school committee member also. And relevant to this warrant article, the spoiler of the 2020 congressional race. And I bring that up because realistically, this is what happened. Throughout that race, I received emails and calls asking me to drop out for, Alan Casey, for different people. And I share this as lived experience as a candidate who was new to politics, an epidemiologist who thought a pandemic was the right time to step in, a woman, someone whose parents live in Greece, therefore, in some way an immigrant, although born in the US, really stepping into politics and having this constant call, step aside, this is not your turn. This is not a race you should be running for. This is the experience that we are saying this electoral system encourages. Many people hear that call. They say, your turn will be in 3 or 4 years. Your turn will be in 10 years. And too often that call is made to women and people of color. In our race in the Massachusetts 4th, it was said that there were too many women running. In Boston, it was said that there were too many Black candidates running. And we know that we have too few women and we have too few Black candidates in politics. So what does it tell us? That our electoral system is telling those candidates that they need to wait, that there can only be one at a time. This is fundamentally the reason why I'm involved in ranked choice voting, because I think our system is simply telling people like me that, you cannot run, you should not run. So now to some of the concerns that we've heard tonight. I've heard that it's complex, and yes, it is complex. I don't understand the math, but I do not understand climate science, and I'm teaching a course on climate and health coming this fall at Harvard. And I bet that none of you understand climate science, and you've been voting unanimously on climate articles because we believe that climate science is real. We believe the people who have done the math. We believe the software, that it's not going to rig our elections. We believe that we need a system that works, and this is true for climate science. Keeping to that analogy, we heard from Representative Vitola that it will take time. Similarly to our home rule petitions that took time around, building clean buildings, this might take time. It won't happen overnight, but it is important to signal that we want an electoral system that encourages more diverse candidates. And that signaling from a Brookline town meeting, this is all we're voting on tonight, it's a signal, may encourage more municipalities to step up. We will be in the news for having done this, and maybe more young people of color, people who don't have tons of wealth, because there is a link to money in my experience. And that's not a direct link, it's the signaling power. Again, I was told that I would never win because there was no way I would raise $4 million in 4 months. And, I'm a data nerd and I did get the most votes per dollar. And, sort of these things in a ranked choice voting, the money wouldn't be that important, neither as a signal nor as an actual impact. So tonight we are here to say, is this system working? Are we truly representative here in town meeting? Is Massachusetts government truly representative? And if your answer is no, let's send the signal that we want people to rethink the electoral process. For me, it's clear. I was told to step aside. Dave Cavell did step aside, and he is, wonderful that he did, but I wish that he hadn't. He was many people's first, second, third in this race, and I do not want us to be punishing candidates. This is what the system currently does. And I do not believe that it is difficult for the voters either. I know that Nancy said that, she wouldn't know how to campaign. I'd still ask all of you for your first vote, but I may not trash some other candidate because maybe they were your top candidate, and so I'd want your second vote too. But I, as a candidate, would be trying to get all of your first vote. It doesn't become complicated for the candidates. I don't think it becomes complicated for the voters. And I think this vote tonight is really about allowing this conversation to continue. If 70% of Brookline believed it was good at the state level, it's important for us to continue that momentum. And complexity, like climate complexity, should not be the obstacle. Thank you.
Michael, thank you.
I am not going to allow the question to be called now because clearly there are a lot of people who have things to say and questions to ask.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Simon Grossman, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 7. About 2.5 years ago, more than 2/3 of Brookline voters supported ranked choice voting in an election with almost 75% turnout in November of 2020. There's no reason to believe they've changed their minds, but I urge fellow town meeting members to support Warrant Article 22 and ranked choice voting, not just because our constituents do, but because it's simply and truly a better voting method. RCV takes into account the depth of voters' preferences, which our current system does not. I hope by now you're not too sick of scenarios, but here's a quick one to illustrate this. You're in JP Licks ordering ice cream, a situation many of us are familiar with. They're out of your favorite flavor. Do you tell the ice cream scooper, I like every other flavor exactly the same, surprise me? Of course not. You order your second favorite. And if they don't have that, you get your third, because people have preferences beyond their first choice. And yeah, it doesn't matter much when we're talking about ice cream, but what people's preferences are really do matter when we're talking about who's going to lead our town. Ranked choice voting allows people's preferences to be heard beyond their first choice. Our current system doesn't. It's as simple as that. And that's not all, because RCV also promotes kinder campaigning while decreasing campaign gamesmanship. Currently, in multi-seat elections, it makes more sense for candidates to encourage voters to bullet vote only for them, regardless of how many votes they have able to be cast. Why is this the case? In a multi-seat election, it only matters how many total votes candidates receive. So voters using their full voting power dilutes the total vote share that their first choice candidate receives. As it stands, candidates for office like the select board or school committee gain an advantage by asking their supporters not to support any other candidates, which can justify political attacks and negative campaign tactics. But with RCV, candidates actually have an incentive to interact positively with each other to attract each other's supporters. In some jurisdictions with RCV, candidates will issue endorsements of other candidates due to the importance of having an expanded base of support. They do this in single and in multi-seat elections. Since I joined town meeting a year ago, I've been told repeatedly that our town politics is riddled with divisiveness and incivility. If this is the case, then shouldn't we be encouraging candidates for public office to reach out to people beyond their core group of supporters? So why support warrant Article 22? Well, in addition to the excellent points made earlier this evening, support it because it lets voters express the depth and nuance of their candidate preferences. Support us so that we stop incentivizing campaign gamesmanship that is antithetical to our democratic values. And support it to promote kinder and more collaborative campaign trails. Thank you, and may JP Licks never run out of your favorite flavor.
Ms. Hardebeck?
Thank you. Kelly Hardebeck, town meeting member from Precinct 7 and member from the advisory committee. My question actually jumps ahead, maybe many years, to implementation. My understanding is that only currently, only 2 cities or towns in Massachusetts use ranked choice voting. And Cambridge, which of course is significantly larger and different from Brookline, has had their proportional method in place since 1942, and it's different from what we're discussing tonight. East Hampton, I believe, is the only other town in the state that uses RCV. And according to their website, they only use it for single winner elections. So as we've seen tonight, this is a complex topic. And should Brookline voters eventually approve ranked choice voting, I'm curious to understand if there's a community in the state we could look to for guidance and best practices, or look to partner with as we hypothetically are seeking to implement ranked choice voting for multi-winner elections.
I'm sorry, I was distracted by my assistant moderator, so if you could
Sure. So basically the question I have, to paraphrase, is, are there other communities in the state that are currently considering multi-winner ranked choice voting for multi-winner elections that we could partner with or look to guidance when it comes time for Brookline to implement?
Is this something that the ranked choice voting committee studied, Mr. Ananian?
C. Scott Ananian, Chair of the Ranked Choice Voting Study Committee. Yes, if you looked at the committee members, the one non-Brookline, non-appointed member of the committee who showed up at just about every meeting, Harry Friedman also, but other than Harry Friedman, was Greg Dennis, who is with Voter Choice MA, who has been invaluable in helping coordinate with other towns and cities who are, as I said, having almost identical home rule petitions before you. My understanding is there's a town clerks conference in a week or two, and there's going to be folks from the pro RCV efforts there talking to clerks. I expect that there will be plenty of opportunities to network. Again, deferring to Mr. Vitolo, assuming that a number of these home rule petitions which are pending, there's about half a dozen of them, get approved at more or less the same time, there should be a crop of folks who we can partner with. I did want to just confirm publicly, I verified that Northampton's pending home rule petition has the exact same language as ours. And if there is an off by one error in the more than this is an excellent opportunity for Brookline to demonstrate and for Mr. Englander, for me to compliment Mr. Englander for catching something which has slipped past at least one city or town before. I look forward to resolving that both here and there. Thanks.
Thank you.
I will ask that People who have questions be given priority. If you have comments in support or opposition, I ask that you cede to those who have questions, as I think that will be most helpful as the evening goes on. It is your choice, but as people are starting to get impatient, I will remind you that we have another article to address after this. And if we lose our quorum, we will be back here tomorrow night. Ms. Roberts.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Susan Roberts, Precinct 17. And I appreciate your last comment because I was going to make a point of order with people using the microphone to make comments that are as long or longer than the speakers without questions. So I do have an observation and a question. And the observation is that it has been disconcerting to me to, number one, understand that there's a mistake in the language of the main motion. It has also been disconcerting to me for there to be wrong math, for there to be wrong way of doing things that have been called out tonight in the various speakers. The fact that there's this warrant article seems to have generated more people standing at the mics than any other that I can remember in a very long time, seems to show that there is a problem, not necessarily with, what you do when you go to the ballot and you make your black marks or whatever number of marks, but what happens after you make that? Do people really understand how their vote is actually going to get counted? And my question was, I did not have confidence that Ms. Gilman's question was answered properly, because I understood that from Mr. Ananian's presentation, that sometimes the votes of those who are last or next to last, those get redistributed. And I would like to have a better understanding of both for single seat elections and multi-seat elections, what happens to those votes. So when Ms. Gilman asked her question, she said, I am voting for somebody who ends up losing. What happens to my votes? And I was curious about whether we could have two answers for multi-seat election and for single seat election. Thank you.
Mr. Ananian.
Thank you, Scott Ananian, Chair, RCV Study Committee. I don't think it will be helpful to go through the slides again, but I'll say in simple terms, if you voted for Ms. Linos in the race and she is the last place candidate, your ballot, the ballot that you filled out, we look at who your second choice was. And if you did not fill out a second choice, that's the end. No votes get made up, no votes get transferred to someone you didn't put down on your ballot. But if you did put on your ballot that said, if Ms. Linos is not going to win, I would like my vote to count for somebody else, then that person gets your vote. It's a transferable vote. And that's substantially the same process that happens in multi-seat elections as well, as we went over. The only slight difference, again, as it was on the slides, is if the first place candidate who you voted for won by a landslide, your second choice and third choice and fourth choice and fifth choice candidate votes may also count as well. So a portion we will look at your second choice ballot, your second choice, your third choice, your fourth choice, and credit it to those candidates. Again, there's nothing going on that you didn't put down on your ballot. It just means we're trying to count every single thing that you put on your ballot in some way. If you only pick out a first choice, then that's all we can do. But if you did express other preferences, then we're going to do our best to honor the preferences that you have set out as far as you have to those candidates that you gave them to. There's nothing is being transferred to anyone who you did not indicate on your ballot that you wanted to support.
No, I'm not calling the question yet. Ms. Wu.
Chi Wu,
Excuse me,
town,
my decision is final. Thank you.
Chi Wu, town meeting member, precinct 7. I have a comment and a question. But before I do that, I wanted to also say, Madam Moderator, that I appreciated your remarks at the beginning of town meeting. Thank you very much from myself. It, takes a very brave woman, very brave person to stand up there and apologize. And on the topic of racial equity, there's been a lot of talk about uplifting communities of color and promoting folks of color in this town meeting and earlier town meetings. And one way to do that is to support ranked choice voting, because we have studies, including from a group Fair Vote, showing that ranked choice voting benefits communities of color, that candidates of color do better with that round by round counting, and they do better when the largest block of voters are white voters, that a lot of white voters do give their second and third choice to candidates of color. So if we want to lift up communities of color, voting for ranked choice voting is one way to do that and better our elections. It's a win-win. Another group that benefits from ranked choice voting is women candidates. In fact, New York City uses ranked choice voting, and for the first time, they elected a majority women city council. Now, New York City, come on, Brookline. If New York City can do it, Brookline can do it. I think we're smarter than them. And I think we're better educated. And my question is, all these concerns, all these, can we do the math? Are people going to be confused? Has ranked choice voting been successful in New York City? That's my question.
Okay, I'm going to take that as rhetorical. Thank you very much.
You're right. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to take a couple of more speakers and then I will accept a motion to call the question. Microphone 2.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you, Madam Moderator. Amy Newell, town meeting member, precinct 7. Forgive, I'm a little anxious. I also was a little bit worried that ranked choice voting might be a little confusing or complicated for people before. So I was thinking, what's something that the average American participates in that might be even more complicated, or at least as complicated and confusing as people are concerned that ranked choice voting might be. And I thought of something that I have never personally participated in, but that Forbes magazine states that 70 million Americans participated in 2023. 20% of them actually put money on it. And that's March Madness. So filling out a March Madness bracket. And so my question, so I don't think that all those people have PhDs. I could be wrong. And of course, I don't want to impugn anybody by stating that anybody here has ever, actually put money, perhaps on an office pool or anything. But my question is, I'm wondering how many town meeting members might have ever filled out a bracket just for funsies. And if so, could someone please explain to me how it works?
Okay. I will take that as rhetorical, but I will also anecdotally say that I totally randomly filled out a bracket and won. So,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Wong, and then I will entertain a motion to call the question.
I'm A1 Wang, town meeting member, precinct A. Thank you, Madam Moderator. Yeah, so I have one comment and 2 questions. The first one is right now we hear all the example are designed to get in favor RCV. So for the candy, like example, for example, if we take black and brown minority as 40%, and the white as 30%, I mean like 60% split into 30 and 30, then it's totally different situation. So the minority actually have the chance to stand out from the current voting system instead of RCN. So like, because I'm a computer game player, so every game can be hacked. So like whoever knows the rule better can hack the game and can get a chance to win. So my first question would be like, how can we prevent people in the next voting with the RCN to using the way, because if they have the advantage, know the rule better, and then they can have the chance to win the vote later. So how can we prevent that from happening?
Mr. Ananian?
See, Scott Ananian, Chair of the Ranked Choice Voting Study Committee and former lobbyist unpaid for verifiedvoting.org, which way back when was very concerned about making sure that our ballot systems were auditable. And I am pleased to say that my work on that regard greatly fell off after moving to Massachusetts, because we use hand-marked paper ballots, and they are in fact recounted on occasion. I've had conversations with Representative Vitolo about ways that our audit process in the state could be further improved, but I am pleased to say that, as you heard from Mr. Kaufman earlier, ranked choice ballots are just as auditable and just as recountable as our existing system. It's just counting pieces of paper, and there's no need to trust the computer. I hope that answers your question.
Well, so my second question is about like, if I have only one choice, then I don't have a second and third choice, but the other people have a second and third choice, then my vote actually has less value than the others, because my vote won't count if I choosing the last one, right? So it's not really a fair system, because if I don't choose the second one or third one, so how can the vote to be fair for everybody? So the weight, pretty much the second and third choice weight shouldn't be the same as the first one.
I think it is true that the more preferences you fill out on the ballot, the more opportunities you have to influence the election. If you only fill out a first choice and your first choice doesn't win, that's where the counting of your ballot stops. So it's certainly the case that filling out, the more completely you can fill out your preferences, the more influence you can have in the election results.
So it's not really fair, right?
Okay, I'm sorry.
So, sorry. Yeah. So my last question, if voter agrees on the ballot question.
I'm sorry, I, 2 bites at the apple, and now we're going to, I'm going to entertain a
Madam
motion.
Moderator, call the question.
Yes. We have a second? Okay, we will now take a vote on whether or not to end debate on this issue. And it takes a 2/3 majority. I will have the town clerk return.
Point of order.
Yes.
Could we hear who was slated
Oh,
to speak
yes, I'm
next?
sorry.
Thank you.
I did forget to do that. I know Marissa Vogt was waiting, Connor Sheehan, Naomi Switzer, Lee
Carolyn
Birnbaum.
Goodwin.
I'm sorry,
Carolyn.
Karen, I'm sorry. Lee Birnbaum, could you announce yourselves? I apologize for. Okay, shock. Were you waiting in line or just lounging? Okay. Mr. Margolis?
Yes, I believe that there were other speakers who. listened
There
who
were,
had
and I
signed up.
apologize.
Vera Fisher, the speakers list.
Okay, I apologize. And
Is it possible to read off the speakers list? Who was left?
there was everyone who, Jonathan Margolis was left and Lee Birnbaum.
I was
And
on the
Vera
speaker
Fisher
list
and
and I
Connor
did not
Sheehan,
get to
yes.
speak. Okay,
But yeah,
got it.
I thought I mentioned you because you were in line, but. Okie dokie. Now let's drop the vote, please, on whether or not to end debate. And thank you for making that point. Okay, the motion to close debate has passed with a vote of 195 yes, 20 no, and 9 abstentions. So we will now turn to the article itself. Let me explain first the two motions you are voting on. The main motion is whether or not to ask the select board to submit a home rule petition that asks permission for Brookline to use ranked choice voting, which would apply to all municipal elections. It would apply to all townwide voting, including, as we said, constables, select board members, town meeting members, and town clerk, moderator, anybody else you can think of. And as I said, town meeting members. We will also be considering the Sandman Amendment, which includes all the above mentioned officials except for town meeting members. We will vote first on the Sandman Amendment. As I said, the Sandman Amendment changes the main initial motion by eliminating town meeting members from ranked choice voting. If that amendment is passed, you would then vote on the main motion, which, if approved, would pass as amended. In other words, it would carry over the elimination of town meeting members. If the amendment that eliminates town meeting members fails, we would then go and vote on the main motion, which would have ranked voting apply to all of the municipal elections in Brookline. We will now vote on the Sandman Amendment, which, as I just explained, would have ranked choice voting apply to all elected officials in Brookline other than town meeting members.
Point of order, Madam Moderator.
Yes, we're.
David
Mr.
Gayshock,
Gayshock.
Precinct 14, just to
Yes.
make sure I'm clear. If I want town meeting members included in ranked choice voting, I should vote no on the Sandman Amendment.
Exactly.
If I don't want them included, I should vote yes. And then either way, we're going to vote on the main motion, either as amended or not.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Okay, we are now going to vote on the Sandman Amendment, which takes out town meeting members. Okay, the Sandman Amendment passes with 165 yes, 54 no, and 95 abstentions? 9. So, okay, my pen got carried away. 9 abstentions. All right, we will now vote on the main motion as amended, which means that we are voting on ranked choice voting in Brookline, but it will not include town meeting members. Or we are voting on whether or not to ask the select board to submit a petition, a home rule petition, asking the legislature to grant it permission to have ranked choice voting in Brookline, but not relating to town meeting member. Okay, please drop the vote. Yes. The motion passes with 100% yes. 100 no, and 7 abstentions. 120 yes, 100 no, 7 abstentions. All right, we still have a quorum, obviously, do we? Yes, okay. All right, we will now turn to Article 23. Article 23 is a resolution filed by Mr. Danell O'Neill, seconded by Elisa Jonas. It is found on, the main motion is the advisory committee amendment, which the petitioner has adopted. It is found on 23.6 to page 23.7 of the combined reports. It is a resolution regarding the adoption of in-car video and body-worn camera policy for the Brookline Police Department. And I will call Mr. O'Neill to the podium first.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Donald O'Neill Senior, Town Meeting Member from Precinct 4. I'm also on the Advisory Committee. Voting yes on Warrant Article 23 is really an opportunity for us as Brookline elected officials to endorse accountability and transparency for our Brookline Police Department and our whole community. Just like our select board has, the advisory committee, our Brookline Police Department, and many, many members of our community have endorsed this article. On May 25th, 2020, George Floyd, a 46-year-old Black man, was murdered. The visual, watching that, hearing George Floyd scream out that I'm not a bad guy, hearing the community members like Donald Williams asking the officer to get off his neck. Community members who felt helpless and could only plead to the officer and officers. It put a bad taste in everyone across the world's mouth. Not just America, not just here. It hit home to everyone. In my opinion, that footage started activating and mobilizing the absence of the spirit of treating others like you'd want to be treated. Or what I've heard before from a wise black man, who heard from another wise black man. I wish for you what you wish for yourself. That footage brought to Brookline three things. The where do we go from here? Put that in quotation marks. That our beloved colleague, Susan Parks, wrote about back on June 8th, 2020, in our Brookline tab. In response to the Saturday, June 6th, Black Lives Matter protest that landed right here in our backyard, right here in Brookline, in front of the police station and library, for those who may have forgotten 3 years ago. Thank you, Susan, for asking that question wherever you are, and I hope we have an answer to that question this evening. I want us to be able to answer to Susan and the others who asked that question. Where do we go from here? I want to be able to say to Susan and the others, we did hit Brookline town meeting. We said yes to resolution warrant article 23, and yes to endorse our Brookline police and community as a whole by endorsing the tools that will allow for accountability and transparency. I'm gonna keep it short because it's 5 of 10. So I would just ask that we all vote yes and endorse accountability and transparency. It's already in our Brookline's policy, collective bargaining agreement. You'll hear more about that later. So please vote yes. Thank you.
Ms. Jonas? Lisa Jonas, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 16, speaking on behalf of the Advisory Committee, and it's very hard to follow the petitioner with this dry speech, but I'll go for it anyways. The Advisory Committee voted by a large majority to support warrant Article 23 with 2 friendly amendments approved by the petitioner. The warrant article is a resolution to endorse the adoption of in-car video and body-worn cameras for the Brookline Police. About half of all local police departments in the country already use some form of body cameras, and an even greater percentage use some form of dashboard cameras. With the horrific killing of George Floyd in 2020, interest in implementing camera policies increased in other communities. In Massachusetts, the legislature established the Law Enforcement Body Camera Task Force as part of the police reform law passed in 2020, which was charged with developing regulations for the use of body cameras by local law enforcement departments. Boston has been using body cameras for several years already, and in Cambridge, which had been considering a camera policy for several years, will begin implementation in the near future, a decision spurred by a fatal police shooting in January. In Brookline, the implementation of body and dashboard cameras has also been a subject of discussion for several years. In September 2020, the town administration and police union entered a memorandum of agreement that committed the union to accept the town's authority to deploy cameras, with the union reserving the right to bargain over terms and conditions. The police contract signed and voted on by town meeting this spring included the implementation of body cameras to begin in the upcoming fiscal year. The police department has identified a vendor that will provide the system for $200,000 a year for a 4-year period. Newton has obtained grants to cover much of their cost, and Chief Pastor is hopeful that Brookline will be able to do the same. But in any case, 200,000 is included in the CIP for fiscal year 24. The advisory committee agrees with the petitioner that cameras are an effective law enforcement tool that has taken on new urgency as the result of tensions that have arisen in town in recent years. The use of cameras will increase accountability and transparency. It provides a useful tool for investigations and evidence collection, preserving documentation of what has occurred at crime and accident scenes, and it will both foster and demonstrate the professionalism of the police department, which in turn will hopefully improve police-community relations. Studies have demonstrated a reduction in complaints against the police and other municipalities where cameras were deployed. Several issues were raised by advisory committee members. One of these is the impact of on the individual's right to privacy. For instance, bystanders and witnesses could unwittingly be caught on camera. In response, it was noted that state law requires that such footage be redacted to protect such individuals from being identified. Another concern raised was that as the capacity to alter videos increases, there's a risk that police footage might be hacked and altered. Yet that risk exists for footage provided by others who might have an interest in showing an alternative story, and the police footage will be stored in a secure location by a third party. Also of concern was the possibility that cameras might not accurately capture what occurred or who the involved parties are. But the recollections of eyewitnesses, if they're even present, are notorious for susceptibility to both inaccuracy and bias. And camera footage also reduces the need to rely on judging who is telling the truth in he said, she said situations when only the parties to a dispute are present. Moreover, camera footage does not replace other evidence. It is an additional tool. One committee member questioned whether the 200,000 budget in the CIP would cover all costs. According to Deputy Superintendent Paul Campbell, the 4-year contract is all-inclusive, covering the cost of equipment, associated software, digital storage, redaction work, training, and maintenance and equipment replacement, while the town will own all the rights to the data that's collected. While the advisory committee strongly supports the deployment of cameras, we also believe it will be important to develop a comprehensive policy to address the complications that come along with the use of cameras. Deputy Superintendent Campbell noted that the town will be able to make use of already existing policies from other municipalities in the state and an ACLU prototype, as well as the standards and procedures identified by the state's Police Reform Task Force. So by a vote of 14 in favor, with only 1 opposed and 6 abstentions, the advisory committee urges town meeting to vote in favor of warrant article 23.
Mr. Green.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Bernard Green for the Select Board. On April 25th, the Select Board voted 4-0 in favor of warrant Article 25 as amended by the Advisory Committee, as we heard. I want to thank Ms. Jonas and Mr. O'Neill for basically telling you everything you need to know about this issue. I'll try to add a few things that were not included that may be useful. So warrant Article 23 requests that the Select Board, along with the PCAC, Police Commissioners Advisory Committee, and town staff work to adopt a policy on body-worn cameras and in-car video, which would be, as Mr. O'Neill said, an affirmation by town meeting of its desire to promptly implement these tools, these law enforcement tools. But some background. Negotiations on police contracts over many months failed to result in an agreement, and the dispute was then submitted to what's called the Joint Labor Management Committee of Arbitrators. The town, as part of that process, submitted its proposals on a variety of issues, including body-worn cameras. And the proposal was to incorporate into the contract that results from this arbitration, a body-worn camera policy. On May 3rd, the panel of arbitrators issued its decision, which did incorporate body-worn cameras into the contract. Warrant Article 23 urges the Select Board, the PCAC, and town staff to promptly implement a body-worn camera and in-car video policy. But the Select Board, as a consequence of the Joint Labor Management Committee award, will do that, irrespective of what town meeting votes. The draft policy that was submitted by the town and attached to the decision will be incorporated into the contract with the police union. Like I said, irrespective of how this body votes. But it is important, in my opinion, and I think in the board's opinion, that town meeting, as Mr. O'Neill said, affirm its commitment to implementing this tool, this law enforcement tool, promptly. It will not be a panacea. And I think we ought to be very clear about that. For example, we all talk about George Floyd. Well, George Floyd was videotaped. I'm sorry, the police killing of George Floyd was videotaped. The police knew they were being videotaped, and they proceeded anyway. That doesn't mean that body cameras are useless. It just means that we shouldn't think of them as a silver bullet solving all of our problems. But they will be an important confidence building tool for the community and a protective tool for good police officers, like we have here in Brookline, to make sure that when there's a dispute as to what actually happened, we can get a good, clear picture, not a perfect picture, but a good picture of what in fact happens. So in summary, the Select Board will implement the body-worn camera policy that was awarded by the Joint Labor Management Committee, and reflecting that our vote on April 25th was 4-0 in favor of the amended warrant Article 23. Thank you.
And Mr. Ananian.
Hello, everyone. Scott Ananian, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 10. I'd like to thank Mr. O'Neill Sr. for bringing these articles. The hour is late, and you've heard a lot from me. I'm not going to go on at length here tonight. I will mention, as Bernard stated, that police body cameras are not a magic bullet for inequity. They're tools, and the way that tools are used matter. Greatly simplifying a complex matter, there's 6 main policy areas to pay attention to in a proposed camera policy. 1, activation, when must they be used? 2, deactivation, when must they be turned off? Technical issues related to the camera system, which tend to depend a lot on the specific model of camera selected. We haven't gotten that far yet. Consequences of improper activation or deactivation. The gold standard here is the ACLU policy called no tape, no testimony. And 5th, footage, custody, retention, and access. And I did see good starts of this in the proposed draft policy. And 6, facial recognition and automated analysis. And there is good language about those as well. I'm pleased that a very brief review showed reasonable stuff for those policies. I don't have a particular position on this warrant article. Cameras are expensive, both initially and in ongoing use. Every year, they cost money to maintain all the footage, to maintain the systems. I'm not certain that this is the best use of town funds at this time, but I do have a particular position on camera policy. The draft policy is a start, but it's not there yet. And I urge the town to continue working on the 6 areas I listed above in connection with the PCAC and the Surveillance and Committee to craft a policy that does justice to Mr. O'Neill's sincere vision for how cameras can help Brookline. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we proceed to totally tie things up, Mr. Kaufman has a, oh God. All right, we are ready to vote on this.
Madam Moderator,
Yes, Ms. Hardibeck.
Amy Hummel, Precinct
Hummel,
12.
Jesus.
Yeah, that's okay.
I'm
It's
pretty
getting late.
humble.
And on my remarks, I did not sign up to speak, but I just want to make a few points that Scott maybe didn't make. I mean, this is clearly going to pass this evening. And I'm hoping it's something that does come before we talk more about in the surveillance. It's a long name, the Surveillance Technology and Military Type Study Equipment Committee, just as far as the policy goes, and to just sort of fortify a little bit of what Scott quickly went through. That I've made these statements before, but a lot of times with this, I think we do look at this as sometimes a silver bullet. But Bernard made the good point that it's not always. That we have a lot of confidence, and we're growing in confidence really as a community around what technology can do for us. And the danger in that is, while it does serve some purpose in some ways, there will always be use policies for any technology. Some that even can be used, very policy matters, but everything, there's a data use for everything. It doesn't mean though we should collect as much data as we possibly can. So the policies that we have around our cameras are important, and that we limit it to only those uses when it's really, really necessary in our fairly safe communities, spending a lot of money on body worn cameras. And what I'm hoping is that we will actually, we're going to buy this. It's an investment. The promise has been made. The contracts are being signed, but that we have a trial policy, because the technology breaks, there are upgrades. And before we invest in additional, changes to that, before we start replacing that we view this as sort of a test period to see how much we actually benefit as a society or as a community. And that, are those dollars better spent on other things regarding policing to keep our community safe, and to really emphasize the human side of community policing. What makes us better people? What makes us a safer community? Do we really want to invest so much over time into technology to do that, as opposed to human relationships and just being better? There's never a nirvana. This won't solve everything, but I do hope that we take this time once we have this all in place and evaluate it before we just start, automatically re-upping, rebuying, and getting new, more powerful technology. And as the software is upgraded, what we get will change too. The final thing that I'll conclude with, was I could add things I've said before, that there are studies that this isn't the wherewithal, but beyond that, any policies that we have, no matter how good they are, right, can always be preempted by state policies or by federal policies, depending on who's sitting in the executive, what's going on. So how we collect data, what we do with it, great. But as we've seen, even with the cameras in town, right, the SIMS cameras, that our policies are easily preempted and can be quickly done. So we need to keep that in mind too, as we collect data. We can be very protective of it, but if other laws come into place that usurp that, doesn't matter. And there's our data out there to be done with, as it will. Thanks.
Mr. Black.
I promise to be brief. Town meeting member Ryan Black, Precinct 7. Apologies for any impreciseness in my remarks, as I only just drafted what I have to say. Firstly, I greatly appreciate the intentions of this warrant article, but feel the need to add a voice in agreement with Mr. Ananian, and as well as the previous speaker about, the efficacy of body worn cameras is often a devil in the details sort of situation. And those details will be of great importance if we want to do our utmost to protect people's civil liberties and not have any sort of undue surveillance. Furthermore, to build upon the idea that body cams are not a magic bullet, I want to call to town meeting's attention back to the work and the proposals out of the Task Force to Reimagine Policing. Many of you who are in town meeting at the time will recall a lot of arguments being made in the spring 2020 town meeting to let's wait and see what the proposals came out of that body. Well, that body has since met and come up with a lot of concrete proposals that I think this body and the select board will hopefully consider in future meetings, including efforts like forming a social service department. I believe that is on the town administrator's radar. Forming a non-police crisis emergency response program similar to Cambridge Heart, which I believe is something actually many community organizers are pushing for up there, as well as a home rule petition to essentially have civilian traffic enforcement, taking that responsibility away from the police to a different union civilian type of town employee. I don't have a natural end to my remarks. Again, just drafted it last there a few minutes ago, so I'll wrap there. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, person at microphone 3.
Ariel Maddox, town meeting member, precinct 10. I came in feeling like this is absolutely something I would want, but then doing some additional reading and research, found myself really in a dilemma and quandary here so I was looking at an ACLU Washington article, the idea that body cameras may have little to no impact on policing, either in preventing police violence or holding police accountable after the fact, may sound counterintuitive, but perhaps it should not be so surprising. And it goes on to talk about bystander footage really helps communities in terms of raising the awareness of the events that we've talked about, and that body camera footage is often not it doing that same job. And that at the same time, body cameras may serve more as a tool to monitor civilians and chill people's rights than to hold officers accountable. So I think there's just a lot more nuance in this, and I really want it to be the thing that we can do, but I'm struggling, and I'm not sure if there are any additional answers that anybody has, but wanted to pose that as a question and dilemma.
Ms. Khan.
Yes, Janice Khan, town meeting member from precinct 15. I'm also chair of the Public Safety Subcommittee of the Advisory Committee. And I'd like to respond to that question. A lot of the research, well, this is coming from the Black community, for one. And Janelle O'Neill brought this before town meeting. Also, before that, this is an accountability measure that the Black community feels is important. And that's the message that we have heard, not once, not twice, but several times. And I respect that perspective. And I really don't care what research. I have a PhD. I do research. But in this case, I think that, we talked earlier, my warrant article, in fact, was about feeling safe in a community. And I think that we need to respect that this will help a demographic in our community feel safer. And I urge you all to support this warrant. Thank you.
I would accept a motion to call the question.
So made.
Madam Moderator, may I?
Okay, okay, there's been a motion to call the question and it's been.
I'm
seconded.
aware. May I just
And
ask?
we
I
are
actually have a
going
question
to-
about data.
I'm sorry.
Secure.
We
Oh,
are
sorry.
now going to vote on whether or not to call the question. It'll be a 2/3 vote.
So one question.
Okay, please drop the question. Yes. Okay, the motion passes and we will now vote on the article itself. Okay, I'm being questioned. Town clerk is my mathematician. Okay, I rely on him. He says it's 2/3. There's a reason I'm a lawyer and not an accountant. So we are now going to vote on whether or not to adopt a resolution pertaining, whether or not to approve a resolution pertaining to the adoption of an in-car video and body-worn camera policy for the Brookline Police Department. It will take a majority vote to pass. And we will drop the vote now. The motion passes with 179 yes, 13 no, and 24 abstentions. All right.
Move to dissolve.
Uh, Mr. Kaufman has a couple of comments before we do.
Apologies.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Before we dissolve tonight, I want to. Can you hear me now? I'm Ben Kaufman. I'm the town clerk. Before we dissolve for the night and dissolve our town meeting, I want us to take a moment to acknowledge the people who make this town meeting happen. As many of you know, town meeting does not come together overnight. And every night when we have town meeting, the work to execute this meeting does not start at 7 p.m. and does not end when we dissolve. Instead, this is the result of months of hard work from dedicated staff from throughout the town. The employees who are here, both those on the stage, those in the back of the auditorium, those in the hallway, and many who you will never see, will usually work an entire day at their jobs in the town, and then afterwards will come and spend many more hours here, setting up for town meeting, working the meeting, and staying after we all leave to clean up and make sure we're ready for the next night. This meeting takes a village or a town. Staff from every town department helps out with these meetings. From the clerk's office, the treasurer's office, the purchasing department, the comptroller's office, the building department, the planning department, the Department of Public Works, the recreation department, the school department, the town administrator's office, the police department and fire department, the health department, the mailroom, our incredible IT staff, our fantastic partners at BIG, and perhaps most of all, the custodial team here at Brookline High School. These people who hand out our tablets, run our soundboard, put up our slideshows, order our cookies, print out our materials, and clean up the messes that we leave behind deserve our deepest gratitude and appreciation. So I hope you will all join me in thanking them for the phenomenal work that they do.
Thank you. Before I take a motion to dissolve, which I am very eager to do, I just want to note that we will dissolve as of tomorrow at 5 o'clock, but I still have to take the motion. This has not been an easy town meeting. There's been a lot of emotion, and much more emotion and surprising amount of rancor and division between people that we had hoped would resolve more by meeting in person. That hasn't happened yet. We will be hybrid in November, but I hope that we can still come together more and that the issues we face will not be as divisive and that I will not be as crabby. So I apologize for those moments. And it really was great to see you all. I hope you have fantastic summers. And I will now take a motion to dissolve, which will be
Madam Moderator.
effective. 1 second, please, as it will not be effective until 5 o'clock p.m. But one more point.
Just thanks to you and your team of assistant moderators for moderating town meeting this time.
Oh,
around.
yes, I apologize. Thank you. Thank you.
And I would like to make a motion to dissolve town meeting as of 5 p.m. tomorrow, I
It's at
believe it
5
was.
p.m. tomorrow to correct any votes. And I do apologize for totally overlooking my assistant moderator, Mr. Karen and Mr. Gadsby. Thank you. Motion to dissolve.
Yes.
All in favor? Any opposed?
No.
All right, hang around. Bye.